It is 9:30, and you are tuned to the frequency that keeps the night alive. Tonight, the sea has no law, the horizon belongs to no one. Men who chose a life beyond the reach of kings and courts, ships vanishing into fog, gold-changing hands in the dark, and a code written not in ink, but in blood and salt water. This is Howard Pyle's Book of Pirates. Welcome to the Sleep Wizard's Library, where wonder has no boundaries and no end. If these tales find you, support the channel and help keep the old magic alive. And tell us, from which corner of the world are you listening tonight? Tom Chist and the Treasure Box. An old-time story of the days of Captain Kidd. Subchapter 1. To tell about Tom Chist and how he got his name, and how he came to be living at the little settlement of Henlopen, just inside the mouth of the Delaware Bay, the story must begin as far back as 1686, when a great storm swept the Atlantic coast from end to end. During the heaviest part of the hurricane, a bark went ashore on the Hen and Chicken Shoals, just below Cape Henlopen, and at the mouth of the Delaware Bay. And Tom Chist was the only soul of all those on board the ill-fated vessel who escaped alive. This story must first be told, because it was on account of the strange and miraculous escape that happened to him at that time that he gained the name that was given to him. Even as late as that time of the American colonies, the little scattered settlement at Henlopen, made up of English with a few Dutch and Swedish people, was still only a spot upon the face of the great American wilderness that spread away, with swamp and forest, no man knew how far to the westward. That wilderness was not only full of wild beasts, but of Indian savages, who every fall would come in wandering tribes to spend the winter along the shores of the fresh-water lakes below Henlopen. There, for 4 or 5 months, they would live upon fish and clams and wild ducks and geese, chipping their arrowheads and making their earthenware pots and pans under the lee of the sand-hills and pine woods below the capes. Sometimes on Sundays, when the Reverend Hilary Jones would be preaching in the little log church back in the woods, those half-clad red savages would come in from the cold and sit squatting in the back part of the church, listening stolidly to the words that had no meaning for them. But about the wreck of the bark in 1686. Such a wreck as that, which then went ashore on the Hen and Chicken Shoals, was a godsend to the poor and needy settlers in the wilderness where so few goods ever came. For the vessel went to pieces during the night, and the next morning the beach was strewn with wreckage. Boxes and barrels, chests and spars, timbers and plank, a plentiful and bountiful harvest to be gathered up by the settlers as they chose, with no one to forbid or prevent them. The name of the bark, as found painted on some of the water barrels and sea chests, was the Bristol Merchant, and she no doubt hailed from England. As was said, the only soul who escaped alive off the wreck was Tom Chist. A settler, a fisherman named Matt Abramson, and his daughter Molly, found Tom. He was washed up on the beach among the wreckage, in a great wooden box which had been securely tied around with a rope and lashed between 2 spars, apparently for better protection in beating through the surf. Matt Abramson thought he had found something of more than usual value when he came upon this chest, but when he cut the cords and broke open the box with his broadaxe, he could not have been more astonished had he beheld a salamander instead of a baby of 9 or 10 months old, lying half smothered in the blankets that covered the bottom of the chest. Matt Abramson's daughter Molly had had a baby who had died a month or so before, so when she saw the little one lying there in the bottom of the chest, she cried out in a great loud voice that the good man had sent her another baby in place of her own. The rain was driving before the hurricane storm in dim slanting sheets, and so she wrapped up the baby in the man's coat she wore and ran off home without waiting to gather up any more of the wreckage. It was Parson Jones who gave the foundling his name. When the news came to his ears of what Matt Abramson had found, he went over to the fisherman's cabin to see the child. He examined the clothes in which the baby was dressed. They were of fine linen and handsomely stitched, and the reverend gentleman opined that the foundling's parents must have been of quality. A kerchief had been wrapped around the baby's neck and under its arms and tied behind, and in the corner, marked with very fine needlework, were the initials T.C. "What do you call him, Molly?" said Parson Jones. He was standing as he spoke with his back to the fire, warming his palms before the blaze. The pocket of the great coat he wore bulged out with a big case bottle of spirits, which he had gathered up out of the wreck that afternoon. "What do you call him, Molly?" "I'll call him Tom, after my own baby." "That goes very well with the initial on the kerchief," said Parson Jones. "But what other name do ye give him? Let it be something to go with the sea." "I don't know," said Molly. "Why not call him Chist, since he was born in a chist out of the sea? Tom Chist. The name goes off like a flash in the pan." And so, Tom Chist he was called, and Tom Chist he was christened. So much for the beginning of the history of Tom Chist. The story of Captain Kidd's treasure box does not begin until the late spring of 1699. That was the year that the famous pirate, coming up from the West Indies, sailed his sloop into the Delaware Bay, where he lay for over a month waiting for news from his friends in New York. For he had sent word to that town asking if the coast was clear for him to return home with the rich prize he had brought from the Indian seas and the coast of Africa, and meantime he lay there in the Delaware Bay waiting for a reply. Before he left, he turned the whole of Tom Chist's life topsy-turvy with something that he brought ashore. By that time Tom Chist had grown into a strong-limbed, thick-jointed boy of 14 or 15 years of age. It was a miserable dog's life he lived with old Mat Abrahamson, for the old fisherman was in his cups more than half the time, and when he was so there was hardly a day passed that he did not give Tom a curse or a buffet, or, like as not, an actual beating. One would have thought that such treatment would have broken the spirit of the poor little foundling, but it had just the opposite effect upon Tom Chist, who was one of your stubborn, sturdy, stiff-willed fellows who only grow harder and more tough the more they are ill-treated. It had been a long time now since he had made any outcry or complaint at the hard usage he suffered from old Mat. At such times he would shut his teeth and bear whatever came to him, until sometimes the half-drunken old man would be driven almost mad by his stubborn silence. Maybe he would stop in the midst of the beating he was administering, and grinding his teeth would cry out, "Why ye say not? Why ye say not? Well, then, I'll see if I can't make ye say not." When things had reached such a pass as this, Molly would generally interfere to protect her foster son, and then she and Tom would together fight the old man until they had wrenched the stick or strap out of his hand. Then old Mat would chase them out of doors and around the house for maybe half an hour, until his anger was cool, when he would go back again, and for a time the storm would be over. Besides his foster mother, Tom Chist had a very good friend in Parson Jones, who used to come over every now and then to Abrahamson's hut upon the chance of getting a half-dozen fish for breakfast. He always had a kind word or two for Tom, who during the winter evenings would go over to the good man's house to learn his letters, and to read and write and cipher a little, so that by now he was able to spell the words out of the Bible and the almanac, and knew enough to change tuppence into 4 halfpennies. This is the sort of boy Tom Chist was, and this is the sort of life he led. In the late spring or early summer of 1699, Captain Kidd's sloop sailed into the mouth of the Delaware Bay and changed the whole fortune of his life. And this is how you come to the story of Captain Kidd's treasure box. End of subchapter 1. Subchapter 2. Old Mat Abrahamson kept the flat-bottomed boat in which he went fishing some distance down the shore, and in the neighborhood of the old wreck that had been sunk on the shoals. This was the usual fishing ground of the settlers, and here old Mat's boat generally lay drawn up on the sand. There had been a thunderstorm that afternoon, and Tom had gone down the beach to bail out the boat in readiness for the morning's fishing. It was full moonlight now, as he was returning, and the night sky was full of floating clouds. Now and then there was a dull flash to the westward, and once a muttering growl of thunder, promising another storm to come. All that day the pirate sloop had been laying just off the shore back of the capes, and now Tom Chist could see the sails glimmering pallidly in the moonlight, spread for drying after the storm. He was walking up the shore homeward when he became aware that at some distance ahead of him there was a ship's boat drawn up on the little narrow beach, and a group of men clustered about it. He hurried forward with a good deal of curiosity to see who had landed, but it was not until he had come close to them that he could distinguish who and what they were. Then he knew that it must be a party who had come off the pirate sloop. They had evidently just landed, and 2 men were lifting out a chest from the boat. One of them was a Negro, naked to the waist, and the other was a white man in his shirt sleeves, wearing petticoat breeches, a Monterey cap upon his head, a red bandana handkerchief around his neck, and gold earrings in his ears. He had a long plaited queue hanging down his back, and a great sheath knife dangling from his side. Another man, evidently the captain of the party, stood at a little distance as they lifted the chest out of the boat. He had a cane in one hand and a lighted lantern in the other, although the moon was shining as bright as day. He wore jack boots and a handsome laced coat, and he had a long drooping mustache that curled down below his chin. He wore a fine feathered hat, and his long black hair hung down upon his shoulders. All this Tom Chist could see in the moonlight that glinted and twinkled upon the gilt buttons of his coat. They were so busy lifting the chest from the boat that at first they did not observe that Tom Chist had come up and was standing there. It was the white man with the long plaited queue and the gold earrings that spoke to him. "Boy, what do you want here, boy?" he said in a rough, hoarse voice. "Where do you come from?" And then, dropping his end of the chest, and without giving Tom time to answer, he pointed off down the beach and said, "You'd better be going about your own business, if you know what's good for you. And don't you come back, or you'll find what you don't want waiting for you." Tom saw in a glance that the pirates were all looking at him, and then, without saying a word, he turned and walked away. The man who had spoken to him followed him threateningly for some little distance, as though to see that he had gone away as he was bidden to do. But presently he stopped, and Tom hurried on alone until the boat and the crew and all were dropped away behind and lost in the moonlight night. Then he himself stopped also, and looked back whence he had come. There had been something very strange in the appearance of the men he had just seen, something very mysterious in their actions, and he wondered what it all meant, and what they were going to do. He stood for a little while thus looking and listening. He could see nothing, and could hear only the sound of distant talking. What were they doing on the lonely shore thus at night? Then, following a sudden impulse, he turned and cut off across the sand hummocks, skirting around inland, but keeping pretty close to the shore, his object being to spy upon them, and to watch what they were about from the back of the low sand hills that fronted the beach. He had gone along some distance in his circuitous return when he became aware of the sound of voices that seemed to be drawing closer to him as he came toward the speakers. He stopped and stood listening, and instantly as he stopped, the voices stopped also. He crouched there silently in the bright, glimmering moonlight, surrounded by the silent stretches of sand, and the stillness seemed to press upon him like a heavy hand. Then suddenly the sound of a man's voice began again, and as Tom listened, he could hear someone slowly counting. 91, the voice began. 92, 93, 94, 95, 96, 97, 98, 99, 100, 101. The slow, monotonous count coming nearer and nearer. 102, 103, 104, and so on in its monotonous reckoning. Suddenly he saw three heads appear above the sandhill, so close to him that he crouched down quickly with a keen thrill, close beside the hummock near which he stood. His first fear was that they might have seen him in the moonlight, but they had not, and his heart rose again as the counting voice went steadily on. 120, it was saying, and 21, and 22, and 23, and 24. And then he who was counting came out from behind the little sandy rise into the white and open level of shimmering brightness. It was the man with the cane whom Tom had seen some time before, the captain of the party who had landed. He carried his cane under his arm now, and was holding his lantern close to something that he held in his hand, and upon which he looked narrowly as he walked with a slow and measured tread in a perfectly straight line across the sand, counting each step as he took it. And 25, and 26, and 27, and 28, and 29, and 30. Behind him walked two other figures. One was the half-naked Negro, the other the man with the plaited queue and the earrings, whom Tom had seen lifting the chest out of the boat. Now they were carrying the heavy box between them, laboring through the sand with shuffling tread as they bore it onward. As he who was counting pronounced the word 30, the two men set the chest down on the sand with a grunt, the white man panting and blowing and wiping his sleeve across his forehead. And immediately he who counted took out a slip of paper and marked something down upon it. They stood there for a long time, during which Tom lay behind the sand hummock watching them, and for a while the silence was uninterrupted. In the perfect stillness Tom could hear the washing of the little waves beating upon the distant beach, and once the faraway sound of a laugh from one of those who stood by the ship's boat. 1, 2, 3 minutes passed, and then the men picked up the chest and started on again, and then again the other man began his counting. 30 and 1, and 30 and 2, and 30 and 3, and 30 and 4. He walked straight across the level open, still looking intently at that which he held in his hand, and 30 and 5, and 30 and 6, and 30 and 7, and so on until the three figures disappeared in the little hollow between the two sand hills on the opposite side of the open, and still Tom could hear the sound of the counting voice in the distance. Just as they disappeared behind the hill there was a sudden faint flash of light, and by, as Tom lay listening to the counting, he heard, after a long interval, a far-away muffled rumble of distant thunder. He waited for a while and then arose and stepped to the top of the sand hummock behind which he had been laying. He looked all about him, but there was no one else to be seen. Then he stepped down from the hummock and followed in the direction which the pirate captain and the two men carrying the chest had gone. He crept along cautiously, stopping now and then to make sure that he still heard the counting voice, and when it ceased he lay down upon the sand and waited until it began again. Presently, so following the pirates, he saw the three figures again in the distance, and, skirting around back of a hill of sand covered with coarse sedge-grass, he came to where he overlooked a little open level space, gleaming white in the moonlight. The three had been crossing the level of sand, and were now not more than 25 paces from him. They had again set down the chest, upon which the white man with the long queue and the gold earrings had seated to rest himself, the negro standing close beside him. The moon shone as bright as day and full upon his face. It was looking directly at Tom Chist, every line as keen-cut with white lights and black shadows as though it had been carved in ivory and jet. He sat perfectly motionless, and Tom drew back with a start, almost thinking he had been discovered. He lay silent, his heart beating heavily in his throat, but there was no alarm, and presently he heard the counting begin again. And when he looked once more, he saw they were going away straight across the little open. A soft, sliding hillock of sand lay directly in front of them. They did not turn aside, but went straight over it, the leader helping himself up the sandy slope with his cane, still counting and still keeping his eyes fixed upon that which he held in his hand. So Tom followed them cautiously until they had gone almost half a mile inland. When next he saw them clearly, it was from a little sandy rise which looked down like the crest of a bowl upon the floor of sand below. Upon this smooth white floor the moon beat with almost dazzling brightness. The white man who had helped to carry the chest was now kneeling, busied at some work, though what it was Tom at first could not see. He was whittling the point of a stick into a long wooden peg, and when, by and by, he had finished what he was about, he arose and stepped to where he who seemed to be the captain had stuck his cane upright into the ground as though to mark some particular spot. He drew the cane out of the sand, thrusting the stick down in its stead. Then he drove the long peg down with a wooden mallet which the negro handed to him. The sharp rapping of the mallet upon the top of the peg sounded loud in the perfect stillness, and Tom lay watching and wondering what it all meant. The man, with quick repeated blows, drove the peg farther and farther down into the sand until it showed only 2 or 3 inches above the surface. As he finished his work there was another faint flash of light, and by another smothered rumble of thunder, and Tom, as he looked out toward the westward, saw the silver rim of the round and sharply outlined thundercloud rising slowly up into the sky and pushing the other and broken drifting clouds before it. The two white men were now stooping over the peg, the negro man watching them. Then presently the man with the cane started straight away from the peg, carrying the end of a measuring line with him, the other end of which the man with the plaited queue held against the top of the peg. When the pirate captain had reached the end of the measuring line, he marked a cross upon the sand, and then again they measured out another stretch of space. So they measured a distance 5 times over, and then, from where Tom lay, he could see the man with the queue drive another peg just at the foot of a sloping rise of sand that swept up beyond into a tall white dune, marked sharp and clear against the night sky behind. As soon as the man with the plaited queue had driven the second peg into the ground, they began measuring again, and so, still measuring, disappeared in another direction, which took them in behind the sand dune, where Tom no longer could see what they were doing. The negro still sat by the chest where the two had left him, and so bright was the moonlight that from where he lay Tom could see the glint of it twinkling in the whites of his eyeballs. Presently from behind the hill there came, for the third time, the sharp rapping sound of the mallet driving still another peg, and then after a while the two pirates emerged from behind the sloping whiteness into the space of moonlight again. They came direct to where the chest lay, and the white man and the black man lifting it once more, they walked straight away across the level of open sand, and so on behind the edge of the hill and out of Tom's sight. End of Subchapter 2. Subchapter 3. Tom Chist could no longer see what the pirates were doing, neither did he dare to cross over the open space of sand that now lay between them and him. He lay there speculating as to what they were about, and meantime the storm cloud was rising higher and higher above the horizon, with louder and louder mutterings of thunder following each dull flash from out of the cloudy cavernous depths. In the silence he could hear an occasional click as of some iron implement, and he opined that the pirates were burying the chest, though just where they were at work he could neither see nor tell. Still he lay there watching and listening, and by a puff of warm air blew across the sand, and a thumping tumble of louder thunder leaped out from the belly of the storm cloud, which every minute was coming nearer and nearer. Still Tom Chist lay watching. Suddenly, almost unexpectedly, the three figures reappeared from behind the sandhill, the pirate captain leading the way, and the negro and white man following close behind him. They had gone about halfway across the white sandy level between the hill and the hummock behind which Tom Chist lay, when the white man stopped and bent over as though to tie his shoe. This brought the negro a few steps in front of his companion. That which then followed happened so suddenly, so unexpectedly, so swiftly, that Tom Chist had hardly time to realize what it all meant before it was over. As the negro passed him, the white man arose suddenly and silently erect, and Tom Chist saw the white moonlight glint upon the blade of a great dirk knife which he now held in his hand. He took 2 silent cat-like steps behind the unsuspecting negro. Then there was a sweeping flash of the blade in the pallid light, and a blow, the thump of which Tom could distinctly hear even from where he lay stretched out upon the sand. There was an instant echoing yell from the black man, who ran stumbling forward, who stopped, who regained his footing, and then stood for an instant as though rooted to the spot. Tom had distinctly seen the knife enter his back, and even thought that he had seen the glint of the point as it came out from the breast. Meantime the pirate captain had stopped, and now stood with his hand resting upon his cane, looking impassively on. Then the black man started to run. The white man stood for a while glaring after him. Then he too started after his victim upon the run. The black man was not very far from Tom when he staggered and fell. He tried to rise, then fell forward again, and lay at length. At that instant the first edge of the cloud cut across the moon, and there was a sudden darkness. But in the silence Tom heard the sound of another blow and a groan, and then presently a voice calling to the pirate captain that it was all over. He saw the dim form of the captain crossing the level sand, and then, as the moon sailed out from behind the cloud, he saw the white man standing over a black figure that lay motionless upon the sand. Then Tom Chist scrambled up and ran away, plunging down into the hollow of sand that lay in the shadows below. Over the next rise he ran, and down again into the next black hollow, and so on over the sliding, shifting sand, panting and gasping. It seemed to him that he could hear footsteps following, and in the terror that possessed him he almost expected every instant to feel the cold knife blade slide between his own ribs in such a thrust from behind as he had seen given to the poor black man. So he ran on like one in a nightmare. His feet grew heavy like lead. He panted and gasped. His breath came hot and dry in his throat. But still he ran and ran until at last he found himself in front of old Matt Abramson's cabin, gasping, panting, and sobbing for breath, his knees relaxed and his thighs trembling with weakness. As he opened the door and dashed into the darkened cabin, for both Matt and Molly were long ago asleep in bed, there was a flash of light, and even as he slammed to the door behind him, there was an instant peal of thunder, heavy as though a great weight had been dropped upon the roof of the sky, so that the doors and windows of the cabin rattled. End of Subchapter 3. Subchapter 4. Then Tom Chist crept to bed, trembling, shuddering, bathed in sweat, his heart beating like a trip-hammer, and his brain dizzy from that long, terror-inspired race through the soft sand in which he had striven to outstrip he knew not what pursuing horror. For a long, long time he lay awake, trembling and chattering with nervous chills, and when he did fall asleep it was only to drop into monstrous dreams in which he once again saw ever enacted, with various grotesque variations, the tragic drama which his waking eyes had beheld the night before. Then came the dawning of the broad wet daylight, and before the rising of the sun Tom was up and out of doors to find the young day dripping with the rain of overnight. His first act was to climb the nearest sandhill and to gaze out toward the offing where the pirate ship had been the day before. It was no longer there. Soon afterward Matt Abramson came out of the cabin, and he called to Tom to go and get a bite to eat, for it was time for them to be away fishing. All that morning the recollection of the night before hung over Tom Chist like a great cloud of boding trouble. It filled the confined area of the little boat and spread over the entire wide spaces of sky and sea that surrounded them. Not for a moment was it lifted. Even when he was hauling in his wet and dripping line, with a struggling fish at the end of it, a recurrent memory of what he had seen would suddenly come upon him, and he would groan in spirit at the recollection. He looked at Matt Abramson's leathery face, at his lantern jaws cavernously and stolidly chewing at a tobacco leaf, and it seemed monstrous to him that the old man should be so unconscious of the black cloud that wrapped them all about. When the boat reached the shore again, he leaped scrambling to the beach, and as soon as his dinner was eaten, he hurried away to find the Dominie Jones. He ran all the way from Abramson's hut to the parson's house, hardly stopping once, and when he knocked at the door he was panting and sobbing for breath. The good man was sitting at the back kitchen doorstop, smoking his long pipe of tobacco out into the sunlight, while his wife within was rattling about among the pans and dishes in preparation of their supper, of which a strong porky smell already filled the air. Then Tom Chist told his story, panting, hurrying, tumbling one word over another in his haste, and Parson Jones listened, breaking every now and then into an ejaculation of wonder. The light of his pipe went out, and the bowl turned cold. "And I don't see why they should have killed the poor black man," said Tom, as he finished his narrative. "Why, that is very easy enough to understand," said the good reverend man. "'Twas a treasure box they buried." In his agitation, Mr. Jones had risen from his seat and was now stumping up and down, puffing at his empty tobacco pipe as though it were still alight. "A treasure box!" cried out Tom. "Aye, a treasure box. And that was why they killed the poor black man. He was the only one, d'ye see, besides the two who knew the place where 'twas hid, and now that they've killed him out of the way, there's nobody but themselves knows. The villains! Tut, tut, look at that now." In his excitement, the Dominie had snapped the stem of his tobacco pipe in two. "Why, then," said Tom, "if that is so, 'tis indeed a wicked bloody treasure, and fit to bring a curse upon anybody who finds it." "'Tis more like to bring a curse upon the soul who buried it," said Parson Jones, "and it may be a blessing to him who finds it. But tell me, Tom, do you think you could find the place again where 'twas hid?" "I can't tell that," said Tom. "'Twas all in among the sand humps, d'ye see, and it was at night into the bargain. Maybe we could find the marks of their feet in the sand," he added. "'Tis not likely," said the reverend gentleman, "for the storm last night would have washed all that away." "I could find the place," said Tom, "where the boat was drawn up on the beach." "Why, then, that's something to start from, Tom," said his friend. "If we can find that, then maybe we can find whither they went from there." "If I was certain it was a treasure box," cried out Tom, "I would rake over every foot of sand betwixt here and Henlopen to find it." "'Twould be like hunting for a pin in a haystack," said the Reverend Hilary Jones. As Tom walked away home, it seemed as though a ton's weight of gloom had been rolled away from his soul. The next day he and Parson Jones were to go treasure hunting together. It seemed to Tom as though he could hardly wait for the time to come. End of subchapter 4. Subchapter 5. The next afternoon Parson Jones and Tom Chist started off together upon the expedition that made Tom's fortune forever. Tom carried a spade over his shoulder, and the reverend gentleman walked along beside him with his cane. As they jogged along up the beach, they talked together about the only thing they could talk about, the treasure box. "And how big did you say 'twas?" quoth the good gentleman. "About so long," said Tom Chist, measuring off upon the spade, "and about so wide, and this deep." "And what if it should be full of money, Tom?" said the reverend gentleman, swinging his cane around and around in wide circles in the excitement of the thought, as he strode along briskly. "Suppose it should be full of money, what then?" "By Moses," said Tom Chist, hurrying to keep up with his friend, "I'd buy a ship for myself, I would, and I'd trade to Injy and to Chiny in my own boat, I would. Suppose the chist was all full of money, sir, and suppose we should find it. Would there be enough in it, d'ye suppose, to buy a ship?" "To be sure there would be enough, Tom, enough and to spare, and a good big lump over." "And if I find it, 'tis mine to keep, is it, and no mistake?" "Why, to be sure it would be yours," cried out the parson in a loud voice. "To be sure it would be yours." He knew nothing of the law, but the doubt of the question began at once to ferment in his brain, and he strode along in silence for a while. "Who else would it be but yours if you find it?" he burst out. "Can you tell me that?" "If ever I have a ship of my own," said Tom Chist, "and if ever I sail to Injy in her, I'll fetch ye back the best chist of tea, sir, that ever was fetched from Cochin Chiny." Parson Jones burst out laughing. "Thank ye, Tom," he said, "and I'll thank ye again when I get my chist of tea. But tell me, Tom, didst thou ever hear of the farmer girl who counted her chickens before they were hatched?" It was thus they talked as they hurried along up the beach together, and so came to a place at last where Tom stopped short and stood looking about him. "'Twas just here," he said. "I saw the boat last night. I know 'twas here, for I mind me of that bit of wreck yonder, and that there was a tall stake drove in the sand just where yon stake stands." Parson Jones put on his spectacles and went over to the stake toward which Tom pointed. As soon as he had looked at it carefully, he called out, "Why, Tom, this has been just drove down into the sand. 'Tis a brand new stake of wood, and the pirates must have set it here themselves as a mark, just as they drove the pegs you spoke about down into the sand." Tom came over and looked at the stake. It was a stout piece of oak nearly 2 inches thick. It had been shaped with some care, and the top of it had been painted red. He shook the stake and tried to move it, but it had been driven or planted so deeply into the sand that he could not stir it. "Aye, sir," he said, "it must have been set here for a mark, for I'm sure 'twas not here yesterday or the day before." He stood looking about him to see if there were other signs of the pirates' presence. At some little distance there was the corner of something white sticking out of the sand. He could see that it was a scrap of paper, and pointing to it, calling out, "Yonder is a piece of paper, sir. I wonder if they left that behind them." It was a miraculous chance that placed that paper there. There was only an inch of it showing, and if it had not been for Tom's sharp eyes, it would certainly have been overlooked and passed by. The next windstorm would have covered it up, and all that afterward happened never would have occurred. "Look, sir," he said, as he struck the sand from it, "it hath writing on it." "Let me see it," said Parson Jones. He adjusted the spectacles a little more firmly astride of his nose as he took the paper in his hand and began conning it. What's all this?" he said. "A whole lot of figures and nothing else." And then he read aloud, "Mark, SSWS by S." "What do you suppose that means, Tom?" "I don't know, sir," said Tom, "but maybe we can understand it better if you read on." "'Tis all a great lot of figures," said Parson Jones, "without a grain of meaning in them so far as I can see, unless they be sailing directions." And then he began reading again. "Mark, SSW by S, 40, 72, 91, 130, 151, 177, 202, 232, 256, 271. Do you see? It must be sailing directions. 299, 335, 362, 386, 415, 446, 469, 491, 522, 544, 571, 598. What a lot of them there be! 626, 652, 676, 695, 724, 851, 876, 905, 940, 967. Peg, S.E. by E, 269 foot. Peg, S.S.W. by S, 427 foot. Peg, dig to the west of this 6 foot. What's that about a peg? Exclaimed Tom. What's that about a peg? And then there's something about digging, too. It was as though a sudden light began shining into his brain. He felt himself growing quickly very excited. "Read that over again, sir," he cried. "Why, sir, you remember I told you they drove a peg into the sand, and don't they say to dig close to it? Read it over again, sir, read it over again." "Peg?" said the good gentleman. "To be sure it was about a peg. Let's look again. Yes, here it is. Peg. S.E. by E, 269 foot. "Aye!" cried out Tom Chist again, in great excitement. "Don't you remember what I told you, sir? 269 foot? Sure, that must be what I saw measuring with the line." Parson Jones had now caught the flame of excitement that was blazing up so strongly in Tom's breast. He felt as though some wonderful thing was about to happen to them. To be sure, he called out in a great big voice. "And then they measured out 427 foot south-southwest by south, and they then drove another peg, and then they buried the box 6 foot to the west of it. Why, Tom Chist, if we've read this aright, thy fortune is made." Tom Chist stood staring straight at the old gentleman's excited face, and seeing nothing but it in all the bright infinity of sunshine. Were they indeed about to find the treasure chest? He felt the sun very hot upon his shoulders, and he heard the harsh, insistent jarring of a tern that hovered and circled with forked tail and sharp white wings in the sunlight just above their heads. But all the time he stood staring into the good old gentleman's face. It was Parson Jones who first spoke. "But what do all these figures mean?" And Tom observed how the paper shook and rustled in the tremor of excitement that shook his hand. He raised the paper to the focus of his spectacles and began to read again. "Mark, 40, 72, 91. "Mark?" cried out Tom, almost screaming. "Why, that must mean the stake yonder. That must be the mark." And he pointed to the oaken stick with its red tip blazing against the white shimmer of sand behind it. "And the 40 and 72 and 91, cried the old gentleman in a voice equally shrill. "Why, that must mean the number of steps the pirate was counting when you heard him." "To be sure that's what they mean," cried Tom Chist. "That is it, and it can be nothing else. Oh, come, sir, let us make haste and find it." Stay, said the good gentleman, holding up his hand, and again Tom Chist noticed how it trembled and shook. His voice was steady enough, though very hoarse, but his hand shook and trembled as though with a palsy. Stay. First of all, we must follow these measurements. And 'tis a marvelous thing," he croaked after a little pause, "how this paper ever came to be here." "Maybe it was blown here by the storm," suggested Tom Chist. Like enough, said Parson Jones. Like enough, after the wretches had buried the chest and killed the poor black man, they were so buffeted and bowsed about by the storm that it was shook out of the man's pocket and thus blew away from him without his knowing aught of it. "But let us find the box," cried out Tom Chist, flaming with his excitement. Aye, said the good man. "Only stay a little, my boy, until we make sure what we're about. I've got my pocket compass here, but we must have something to measure off the feet when we have found the peg. You run across to Tom Brooks's house and fetch that measuring rod he used to lay out his new byre. While you're gone, I'll pace off the distance marked on the paper with my pocket compass here." End of Subchapter 5. Subchapter 6. Tom Chist was gone for almost an hour, though he ran nearly all the way and back, upborne as on the wings of the wind. When he returned, panting, Parson Jones was nowhere to be seen, but Tom saw his footsteps leading away inland, and he followed the scuffling marks in the smooth surface across the sand humps and down into the hollows, and by found the good gentleman in a spot he at once knew as soon as he laid his eyes upon it. It was the open space where the pirates had driven their first peg, and where Tom Chist had afterward seen them kill the poor black man. Tom Chist gazed around as though expecting to see some sign of the tragedy, but the space was as smooth and as undisturbed as a floor, excepting where, midway across it, Parson Jones, who was now stooping over something on the ground, had trampled it all around about. When Tom Chist saw him, he was still bending over, scraping away from something he had found. It was the first peg. Inside of half an hour they had found the second and third pegs, and Tom Chist stripped off his coat and began digging like mad down into the sand, Parson Jones standing over him watching him. The sun was sloping well toward the west when the blade of Tom Chist's spade struck upon something hard. If it had been his own heart that he had hit in the sand, his breast could hardly have thrilled more sharply. It was the treasure box. Parson Jones himself leaped down into the hole and began scraping away the sand with his hands as though he had gone crazy. At last, with some difficulty, they tugged and hauled the chest up out of the sand to the surface, where it lay covered all over with the grit that clung to it. It was securely locked and fastened with a padlock, and it took a good many blows with the blade of the spade to burst the bolt. Parson Jones himself lifted the lid. Tom Chist leaned forward and gazed down into the open box. He would not have been surprised to have seen it filled full of yellow gold and bright jewels. It was filled half full of books and papers, and half full of canvas bags tied safely and securely around and around with cords of string. Parson Jones lifted out one of the bags, and it jingled as he did so. It was full of money. He cut the string, and with trembling, shaking hands, handed the bag to Tom, who, in an ecstasy of wonder and dizzy with delight, poured out with swimming sight upon the coat spread on the ground a cataract of shining silver money that rang and twinkled and jingled as it fell in a shining heap upon the coarse cloth. Parson Jones held up both hands into the air, and Tom stared at what he saw, wondering whether it was all so, and whether he was really awake. It seemed to him as though he was in a dream. There were 22 bags in all in the chest, 10 of them full of silver money, 8 of them full of gold money, 3 of them full of gold dust, and 1 small bag with jewels, wrapped up in wad cotton and paper. "'Tis enough," cried out Parson Jones, "to make us both rich men as long as we live." The burning summer sun, though sloping in the sky, beat down upon them as hot as fire, but neither of them noticed it. Neither did they notice hunger or thirst nor fatigue, but sat there as though in a trance, with the bags of money scattered on the sand around them, a great pile of money heaped upon the coat, and the open chest beside them. It was an hour of sundown before Parson Jones had begun fairly to examine the books and papers in the chest. Of the 3 books, 2 were evidently log books of the pirates who had been lying off the mouth of the Delaware Bay all this time. The other book was written in Spanish, and was evidently the log book of some captured prize. It was then, sitting there upon the sand, the good old gentleman reading in his high, crackling voice, that they first learned from the bloody records in those 2 books who it was who had been lying inside the cape all this time, and that it was the famous Captain Kidd. Every now and then the reverend gentleman would stop to explain, "Oh, the bloody wretch!" or "Oh, the desperate, cruel villains!" and then would go on reading again, a scrap here and a scrap there. And all the while Tom Chist sat and listened, every now and then reaching out furtively and touching the heap of money still lying upon the coat. One might be inclined to wonder why Captain Kidd had kept those bloody records. He had probably laid them away because they so incriminated many of the great people of the colony of New York that with the books in evidence it would have been impossible to bring the pirate to justice without dragging a dozen or more fine gentlemen into the dock along with him. If he could have kept them in his own possession, they would doubtless have been a great weapon of defense to protect him from the gallows. Indeed, when Captain Kidd was finally brought to conviction and hung, he was not accused of his piracies, but of striking a mutinous seaman upon the head with a bucket and accidentally killing him. The authorities did not dare try him for piracy. He was really hung because he was a pirate, and we know that it was the log books that Tom Chist brought to New York that did the business for him. He was accused and convicted of manslaughter for killing of his own ship carpenter with a bucket. So Parson Jones, sitting there in the slanting light, read through these terrible records of piracy, and Tom, with the pile of gold and silver money beside him, sat and listened to him. What a spectacle if anyone had come upon them! But they were alone, with the vast arc of sky empty above them, and the wide white stretch of sand a desert around them. The sun sank lower and lower, until there was only time to glance through the other papers in the chest. They were nearly all goldsmiths' bills of exchange, drawn in favor of certain of the most prominent merchants of New York. Parson Jones, as he read over the names, knew of nearly all the gentlemen by hearsay. Aye, here was this gentleman. He thought that name would be among 'em. What? Here is Mr. So-and-so. Well, if all they say is true, the villain has robbed one of his own best friends. I wonder, he said, why the wretch should have hidden these papers so carefully away with the other treasures, for they could do him no good. Then, answering his own question, like enough because these will give him a hold over the gentleman to whom they are drawn, so that he can make a good bargain for his own neck before he gives the bills back to their owners. I tell you what it is, Tom, he continued. It is you yourself shall go to New York and bargain for the return of these papers. 'Twill be as good as another fortune to you. The majority of the bills were drawn in favor of one Richard Chillingsworth, Esquire, and he is, said Parson Jones, one of the richest men in the province of New York. You shall go to him with the news of what we have found. When shall I go? Said Tom Chist. You shall go upon the very first boat we can catch, said the parson. He had turned, still holding the bills in his hand, and was now fingering over the pile of money that yet lay tumbled about upon the coat. I wonder, Tom, said he, if you could spare me a score or so of these doubloons. You shall have 50 score if you choose, said Tom, bursting with gratitude and with generosity in his newly found treasure. You are as fine a lad as ever I saw, Tom, said the parson, and I'll thank you to the last day of my life. Tom scooped up a double handful of silver money. Take it, sir, he said, and you may have as much more as you want of it. He poured it into the dish that the good man made of his hands, and the parson made a motion as though to empty it into his pocket. Then he stopped, as though a sudden doubt had occurred to him. I don't know that 'tis fit for me to take this pirate money, after all, he said. But you are welcome to it, said Tom. Still the parson hesitated. Nay, he burst out, I'll not take it. 'Tis blood money. And as he spoke he chucked the whole double handful into the now empty chest, then arose and dusted the sand from his breeches. Then, with a great deal of bustling energy, he helped to tie the bags again and put them all back into the chest. They reburied the chest in the place whence they had taken it, and then the parson folded the precious paper of directions, placed it carefully in his wallet, and his wallet in his pocket. Tom, he said for the 20th time, your fortune has been made this day. And Tom Chist, as he rattled in his breeches pocket the half-dozen doubloons he had kept out of his treasure, felt that what his friend had said was true. As the two went back homeward across the level space of sand, Tom Chist suddenly stopped stock still and stood looking about him. 'Twas just here, he said, digging his heel down into the sand, that they killed the poor black man. And here he lies buried for all time, said Parson Jones, and as he spoke he dug his cane down into the sand. Tom Chist shuddered. He would not have been surprised if the ferrule of the cane had struck something soft beneath that level surface, but it did not, nor was any sign of that tragedy ever seen again. For, whether the pirates had carried away what they had done and buried it elsewhere, or whether the storm in blowing the sand had completely leveled off and hidden all sign of that tragedy where it was enacted, certain it is that it never came to sight again, at least so far as Tom Chist and the Reverend Hilary Jones ever knew. End of Subchapter 6. Subchapter 7. This is the story of the treasure box. All that remains now is to conclude the story of Tom Chist, and to tell of what came of him in the end. He did not go back again to live with old Matt Abramson. Parson Jones had now taken charge of him and his fortunes, and Tom did not have to go back to the fisherman's hut. Old Abramson talked a great deal about it, and would come in his cups and harangue good Parson Jones, making a vast protestation of what he would do to Tom, if he ever caught him, for running away. But Tom on all these occasions kept carefully out of his way, and nothing came of the old man's threatenings. Tom used to go over to see his foster mother now and then, but always when the old man was from home, and Molly Abramson used to warn him to keep out of her father's way. He's in as vile a humor as ever I see, Tom, she said. He sits sulking all day long, and 'tis my belief he'd kill ye if he caught ye. Of course Tom said nothing, even to her, about the treasure, and he and the reverend gentleman kept the knowledge thereof to themselves. About 3 weeks later, Parson Jones managed to get him shipped aboard of a vessel bound for New York town, and a few days later Tom Chist landed at that place. He had never been in such a town before, and he could not sufficiently wonder and marvel at the number of brick houses, at the multitude of people coming and going along the fine hard earthen sidewalk, at the shops and the stores where goods hung in the windows, and most of all, the fortifications and the battery at the point, at the rows of threatening cannon, and at the scarlet-coated sentries pacing up and down the ramparts. All this was very wonderful, and so were the clustered boats riding at anchor in the harbor. It was like a new world. So different was it from the sandhills and the sedgy levels of Henlopen. Tom Chist took up his lodgings at a coffee-house near to the town hall, and thence he sent by the postboy a letter written by Parson Jones to Master Chillingsworth. In a little while the boy returned with a message, asking Tom to come up to Mr. Chillingsworth's house that afternoon at 2 o'clock. Tom went thither with a great deal of trepidation, and his heart fell away altogether when he found it a fine, grand brick house, 3 stories high, and with wrought iron letters across the front. The counting-house was in the same building, but Tom, because of Mr. Jones's letter, was conducted directly into the parlor, where the great rich man was awaiting his coming. He was sitting in a leather-covered armchair, smoking a pipe of tobacco, and with a bottle of fine old Madeira close to his elbow. Tom had not had a chance to buy a new suit of clothes yet, and so he cut no very fine figure in the rough dress he had brought with him from Henlopen. Nor did Mr. Chillingsworth seem to think very highly of his appearance, for he sat looking sideways at Tom as he smoked. "Well, my lad," he said, "and what is this great thing you have to tell me that is so mightily wonderful? I got what's-his-name, Mr. Jones's letter, and now I'm ready to hear what you have to say." But if he thought but little of his visitor's appearance at first, he soon changed his sentiments toward him, for Tom had not spoken 20 words when Mr. Chillingsworth's whole aspect changed. He straightened himself up in his seat, laid aside his pipe, pushed away his glass of Madeira, and bade Tom take a chair. He listened without a word as Tom Chist told of the buried treasure, of how he had seen the poor negro murdered, and of how he and Parson Jones had recovered the chest again. Only once did Mr. Chillingsworth interrupt the narrative. "And to think," he cried, "that the villain this very day walks about New York town as though he were an honest man, ruffling it with the best of us. But if we can only get hold of these log books you speak of. Go on, tell me more of this." When Tom Chist's narrative was ended, Mr. Chillingsworth's bearing was as different as daylight is from dark. He asked 1,000 questions, all in the most polite and gracious tone imaginable, and not only urged a glass of his fine old Madeira upon Tom, but asked him to stay to supper. There was nobody to be there, he said, but his wife and daughter. Tom, all in a panic at the very thought of the 2 ladies, sturdily refused to stay even for the dish of tea Mr. Chillingsworth offered him. He did not know that he was destined to stay there as long as he should live. "And now," said Mr. Chillingsworth, "tell me about yourself." "I have nothing to tell, your honor," said Tom, "except that I was washed up out of the sea." "Washed up out of the sea?" exclaimed Mr. Chillingsworth. "Why, how was that? Come, begin at the beginning, and tell me all." Thereupon Tom Chist did as he was bidden, beginning at the very beginning and telling everything just as Molly Abramson had often told it to him. As he continued, Mr. Chillingsworth's interest changed into an appearance of stronger and stronger excitement. Suddenly he jumped up out of his chair and began to walk up and down the room. "Stop! Stop!" he cried out at last, in the midst of something Tom was saying. "Stop! Stop! Tell me, do you know the name of the vessel that was wrecked and from which you were washed ashore?" "I've heard it said," said Tom Chist. "'Twas the Bristol merchant." "I knew it! I knew it!" exclaimed the great man in a loud voice, flinging his hands up into the air. "I felt it was so the moment you began the story. But tell me this. Was there nothing found with you with a mark or a name upon it?" "There was a kerchief," said Tom, "marked with a T and a C." "Theodosia Chillingsworth!" cried out the merchant. "I knew it! I knew it! Heavens! To think of anything so wonderful happening as this! Boy, boy, dost thou know who thou art? Thou art my own brother's son. His name was Oliver Chillingsworth, and he was my partner in business, and thou art his son." Then he ran out into the entryway, shouting and calling for his wife and daughter to come. So Tom Chist, or Thomas Chillingsworth, as he now was to be called, did stay to supper after all. This is the story, and I hope you may like it, for Tom Chist became rich and great, as was to be supposed, and he married his pretty cousin Theodosia, who had been named for his own mother, drowned in the Bristol merchant. He did not forget his friends, but had Parson Jones brought to New York to live. As to Molly and Matt Abramson, they both enjoyed a pension of £10 a year for as long as they lived, for now that all was well with him, Tom bore no grudge against the old fisherman for all the drubbings he had suffered. The treasure chest was brought on to New York, and if Tom Chist did not get all the money there was in it, as Parson Jones had opined he would, he got at least a good big lump of it. And it is my belief that those logbooks did more to get Captain Kidd arrested in Boston town and hanged in London than anything else that was brought up against him. End of subchapter 7. End Tom Chist and the Treasure Box. Jack Ballister's Fortunes. We, of these times, protected as we are by the laws and by the number of people about us, can hardly comprehend such a life as that of the American colonies in the early part of the 18th century, when it was possible for a pirate like Captain Teach, known as Blackbeard, to exist, and for the governor and the secretary of the province in which he lived perhaps to share his plunder, and to shelter and to protect him against the law. At that time, the American colonists were in general a rough, rugged people, knowing nothing of the finer things of life. They lived mostly in little settlements, separated by long distances from one another, so that they could neither make nor enforce laws to protect themselves. Each man, or little group of men, had to depend upon his or their own strength to keep what belonged to them, and to prevent fierce men or groups of men from seizing what did not belong to them. It is the natural disposition of everyone to get all that he can. Little children, for instance, always try to take away from others that which they want, and to keep it for their own. It is only by constant teaching that they learn that they must not do so, that they must not take by force what does not belong to them. So it is only by teaching and training that people learn to be honest and not to take what is not theirs. When this teaching is not sufficient to make a man learn to be honest, or when there is something in the man's nature that makes him not able to learn, then he only lacks the opportunity to seize upon the things he wants, just as he would do if he were a little child. In the colonies at that time, as was just said, men were too few and scattered to protect themselves against those who had made up their minds to take by force that which they wanted, and so it was that men lived an unrestrained and lawless life, such as we of these times of better government can hardly comprehend. The usual means of commerce between province and province was by water in coasting vessels. These coasting vessels were so defenseless, and the different colonial governments were so ill able to protect them, that those who chose to rob them could do it almost without danger to themselves. So it was that all the western world was, in those days, infested with armed bands of cruising freebooters or pirates, who used to stop merchant vessels and take from them what they chose. Each province in those days was ruled over by a royal governor, appointed by the king. Each governor at one time was free to do almost as he pleased in his own province. He was accountable only to the king and his government, and England was so distant that he was really responsible almost to nobody but himself. The governors were naturally just as desirous to get rich quickly, just as desirous of getting all that they could for themselves as was anybody else. Only they had been taught and had been able to learn that it was not right to be an actual pirate or robber. They wanted to be rich easily and quickly, but the desire was not strong enough to lead them to dishonor themselves in their own opinion and in the opinion of others by gratifying their selfishness. They would even have stopped the pirates from doing what they did if they could, but their provincial governments were too weak to prevent the freebooters from robbing merchant vessels, or to punish them when they came ashore. The provinces had no navies, and they really had no armies. Neither were there enough people living within the community to enforce the laws against those stronger and fiercer men who were not honest. After the things the pirates seized from merchant vessels were once stolen, they were altogether lost. Almost never did any owner apply for them, for it would be useless to do so. The stolen goods and merchandise lay in the storehouses of the pirates, seemingly without any owner excepting the pirates themselves. The governors and secretaries of the colonies would not dishonor themselves by pirating upon merchant vessels, but it did not seem so wicked after the goods were stolen,
and so altogether lost, to take a part of that which seemed to have no owner. A child is taught that it is a very wicked thing to take, for instance, by force, a lump of sugar from another child. But when a wicked child has seized the sugar from another and taken it around the corner, and that other child from whom he has seized it has gone home crying, it does not seem so wicked for the third child to take a bite of the sugar when it is offered to him, even if he thinks it has been taken from someone else. It was just so, no doubt, that it did not seem so wicked to Governor Eden and Secretary Knight of North Carolina, or to Governor Fletcher of New York, or to other colonial governors, to take a part of the booty that the pirates, such as Blackbeard, had stolen. It did not even seem very wicked to compel such pirates to give up a part of what was not theirs, and which seemed to have no owner. In Governor Eden's time, however, the colonies had begun to be more thickly peopled, and the laws had gradually become stronger and stronger to protect men in the possession of what was theirs. Governor Eden was the last of the colonial governors who had dealings with the pirates, and Blackbeard was almost the last of the pirates who, with his banded men, was savage and powerful enough to come and go as he chose among the people whom he plundered. Virginia, at that time, was the greatest and the richest of all the American colonies, and upon the farther side of North Carolina was the province of South Carolina, also strong and rich. It was these two colonies that suffered the most from Blackbeard, and it began to be that the honest men that lived in them could endure no longer to be plundered. The merchants and traders and others who suffered cried out loudly for protection, so loudly that the governors of these provinces could not help hearing them. Governor Eden was petitioned to act against the pirates, but he would do nothing, for he felt very friendly toward Blackbeard, just as a child who has had a taste of the stolen sugar feels friendly toward the child who gives it to him. At last, when Blackbeard sailed up into the very heart of Virginia and seized upon and carried away the daughter of that colony's foremost people, the governor of Virginia, finding that the governor of North Carolina would do nothing to punish the outrage, took the matter into his own hands and issued a proclamation offering a reward of 100 pounds for Blackbeard, alive or dead, and different sums for the other pirates who were his followers. Governor Spottiswoode had the right to issue the proclamation, but he had no right to commission Lieutenant Maynard, as he did, to take down an armed force into the neighboring province and to attack the pirates in the waters of the North Carolina Sounds. It was all a part of the rude and lawless condition of the colonies at the time that such a thing could have been done. The governor's proclamation against the pirates was issued upon the 11th day of November. It was read in the churches the Sunday following, and was posted upon the doors of all the government custom offices in Lower Virginia. Lieutenant Maynard, in the boats that Colonel Parker had already fitted out to go against the pirates, set sail upon the 17th of the month for Ocracoke. 5 days later the battle was fought. Blackbeard's sloop was lying inside of Ocracoke Inlet among the shoals and sandbars when he first heard of Governor Spottiswoode's proclamation. There had been a storm, and a good many vessels had run into the inlet for shelter. Blackbeard knew nearly all of the captains of these vessels, and it was from them that he first heard of the proclamation. He had gone aboard one of the vessels, a coaster from Boston. The wind was still blowing pretty hard from the southeast. There were maybe a dozen vessels lying within the inlet at the time, and the captain of one of them was paying the Boston skipper a visit when Blackbeard came aboard. The two captains had been talking together. They instantly ceased when the pirate came down into the cabin, but he had heard enough of their conversation to catch its drift. "Why do ye stop?" he said. "I heard what you said." "Well, what then? Do ye think I minded at all? Spottiswoode is going to send his bullies down here after me. That's what you were saying. Well, what then? You don't think I'm afraid of his bullies, do you?" "Why, no, Captain, I didn't say you was afraid," said the visiting captain. "And what right has he got to send down here against me in North Carolina, I should like to ask you?" "He's got none at all," said the Boston captain soothingly. "Won't you take a taste of Hollands, Captain?" "He's no more right to come blustering down here into Governor Eden's province than I have to come aboard of your schooner here, Tom Burley, and to carry off 2 or 3 kegs of prime Hollands for my own drinking." Captain Burley, the Boston man, laughed a loud, forced laugh. "Why, Captain," he said, "as for 2 or 3 kegs of Hollands, you won't find that aboard. But if you'd like to have a keg of it for your own drinking, I'll send it to you and be glad enough to do so for old acquaintances' sake." "But I tell you what 'tis, Captain," said the visiting skipper to Blackbeard. "They're determined to set against you this time. I tell you, Captain, Governor Spottiswoode hath issued a hot proclamation against you, and hath been read out in all the churches. I myself saw it posted in Yorktown upon the custom-house door, and read it there myself. The governor offers £100 for you, and £50 for your officers, and £20 each for your men." "Well, then," said Blackbeard, holding up his glass, "here, I wish 'em good luck, and when they get their £100 from me, they'll be in a poor way to spend it. As for the Hollands," said he, turning to Captain Burley, "I know what you've got aboard here and what you haven't. D'ye suppose ye can blind me? Very well, you send over 2 kegs, and I'll let you go without search." The 2 captains were very silent. "As for that Lieutenant Maynard you're all talking about," said Blackbeard, "why, I know him very well. He was the one who was so busy with the pirates down Madagascar way. I believe you'd all like to see him blow me out of the water, but he can't do it. There's nobody in His Majesty's service I'd rather meet than Lieutenant Maynard. I'll teach him pretty briskly that North Carolina isn't Madagascar." On the evening of the 22nd, the 2 vessels under command of Lieutenant Maynard came into the mouth of Ocracoke Inlet and there dropped anchor. Meantime the weather had cleared, and all the vessels but one had gone from the inlet. The one vessel that remained was a New Yorker. It had been there over a night and a day, and the captain and Blackbeard had become very good friends. The same night that Maynard came into the inlet, a wedding was held on the shore. A number of men and women came up the beach in ox carts and sledges. Others had come in boats from more distant points and across the water. The captain of the New Yorker and Blackbeard went ashore together a little after dark. The New Yorker had been aboard of the pirate sloop for all the latter part of the afternoon, and he and Blackbeard had been drinking together in the cabin. The New York man was now a little tipsy, and he laughed and talked foolishly as he and Blackbeard were rowed ashore. The pirate sat grim and silent. It was nearly dark when they stepped ashore on the beach. The New York captain stumbled and fell headlong, rolling over and over, and the crew of the boat burst out laughing. The people had already begun to dance in an open shed fronting upon the shore. There were fires of pine knots in front of the building, lighting up the interior with a red glare. A negro was playing a fiddle somewhere inside, and the shed was filled with a crowd of grotesque dancing figures, men and women. Now and then they called with loud voices as they danced, and the squeaking of the fiddle sounded incessantly through the noise of outcries and the stamp and shuffling of feet. Captain Teach and the New York captain stood looking on. The New York man had tilted himself against a post, and stood there holding one arm around it, supporting himself. He waved the other hand foolishly in time to the music, now and then snapping his thumb and finger. The young woman who had just been married approached the 2. She had been dancing, and she was warm and red, her hair blowsed about her head. "Hi, Captain, won't you dance with me?" she said to Blackbeard. Blackbeard stared at her. "Who be you?" he said. She burst out laughing. "You look as if you'd eat a body," she cried. Blackbeard's face gradually relaxed. "Why, to be sure, you're a brazen one for all the world," he said. "Well, I'll dance with you, that I will. I'll dance the heart out of you." He pushed forward, thrusting aside with his elbow the newly made husband. The man, who saw that Blackbeard had been drinking, burst out laughing, and the other men and women who had been standing around drew away, so that in a little while the floor was pretty well cleared. One could see the negro now. He sat on a barrel at the end of the room. He grinned with his white teeth, and without stopping in his fiddling, scraped his bow harshly across the strings, and then instantly changed the tune to a lively jig. Blackbeard jumped up into the air and clapped his heels together, giving, as he did so, a sharp, short yell. Then he began instantly dancing grotesquely and violently. The woman danced opposite him, this way and that, with her knuckles on her hips. Everybody burst out laughing at Blackbeard's grotesque antics. They laughed again and again, clapping their hands, and the negro scraped away on his fiddle like fury. The woman's hair came tumbling down her back. She tucked it back, laughing and panting, and the sweat ran down her face. She danced and danced. At last she burst out laughing and stopped, panting. Blackbeard again jumped up in the air and clapped his heels. Again he yelled, and as he did so, he struck his heels upon the floor and spun around. Once more everybody burst out laughing, clapping their hands, and the negro stopped fiddling. Near by was a shanty or cabin where they were selling spirits, and by Blackbeard went there with the New York captain, and presently they began drinking again. "Hi, Captain," called one of the men. "Maynard's out yonder in the inlet. Jack Bishop's just come across to other side. He says Maynard hailed him and asked for a pilot to fetch him in." "Well, here's luck to him, and he can't come in quick enough for me," cried out Blackbeard in his hoarse, husky voice. "Well, Captain," called a voice, "will ye fight him tomorrow?" "Aye," shouted the pirate, "if he can get into me. I'll try to give him what they seek, and all they want of it into the bargain. As for a pilot, I'll tell ye what 'tis. If any man hereabouts goes out there to pilot that villain in, 'twill be the worst day's work he ever did in all of his life. 'Twon't be fit for him to live in these parts of America if I'm a livin' here at the same time." There was a burst of laughter. "Give us a toast, Captain. Give us something to drink to." "Aye, Captain, a toast! A toast!" A half-dozen voices were calling out at the same time. "Well," cried out the pirate captain, "here's to a good hot fight tomorrow, and the best dog on top. 'Twill be bang, bang, this way." He began pulling a pistol out of his pocket, but it stuck in the lining, and he struggled and tugged at it. The men ducked and scrambled away from before him, and then the next moment he had the pistol out of his pocket. He swung it around and around. There was perfect silence. Suddenly there was a flash and a stunning report, and instantly a crash and a tinkle of broken glass. One of the men cried out and began picking and jerking at the back of his neck. "He's broken that bottle all down my neck," he called out. "That's the way 'twill be," said Blackbeard. "Lookee," said the owner of the place, "I won't serve out another drop if 'tis going to be like that. If there's any more trouble, I'll blow out the lantern." The sound of the squeaking and scraping of the fiddle and the shouts and the scuffling feet still came from the shed where the dancing was going on. "Suppose you get your dose tomorrow, Captain," someone called out. "What then?" "Why, if I do," said Blackbeard, "I'll get it, and that's all there is of it." "Your wife'll be a rich widdy then, won't she?" cried one of the men, and there was a burst of laughter. "Why," said the New York captain, "why has a bloody pirate like you a wife, then, like any honest man?" "She'll be no richer than she is now," said Blackbeard. "She knows where you've hid your money anyways, don't she, Captain?" called out a voice. "The divil knows where I've hid my money," said Blackbeard, "and I know where I've hid it. And the longest liver of the twain will get it all, and that's all there is of it." The gray of the early day was beginning to show in the east when Blackbeard and the New York captain came down to the landing together. The New York captain swayed and toppled this way and that as he walked, now falling against Blackbeard and now staggering away from him. End of Jack Ballister's Fortunes. Early in the morning, perhaps 8 o'clock, Lieutenant Maynard sent a boat from the schooner over to the settlement, which lay some 4 or 5 miles distant. A number of men stood lounging on the landing, watching the approach of the boat. The men rowed up close to the wharf, and there lay upon their oars, while the boatswain of the schooner, who was in command of the boat, stood up and asked if there was any man there who could pilot them over the shoals. Nobody answered, but all stared stupidly at him. After a while one of the men at last took his pipe out of his mouth. "There bean't any pilot here, master," said he. "We bean't pilots." "Why, what a story you do tell," roared the boatswain. "D'ye suppose I've never been down here before, not to know that every man about here knows the passes of the shoals?" The fellow still held his pipe in his hand. He looked at another one of the men. "Do you know the passes in over the shoals, Jim?" said he. The man to whom he spoke was a young fellow with long, shaggy, sunburnt hair hanging over his eyes in an unkempt mass. He shook his head, grunting. "Nay, I don't know naught about t' shoals." "'Tis Lieutenant Maynard of His Majesty's Navy in command of them vessels out there," said the boatswain. "He'll give any man £5 to pilot him in." The men on the wharf looked at one another, but still no one spoke, and the boatswain stood looking at them. He saw that they did not choose to answer him. "Why," he said, "I believe you've not got right wits. That's what I believe is the matter with you. Pull me up to the landing, men, and I'll go ashore and see if I can find anybody that's willing to make £5 for such a little bit of piloting as that." After the boatswain had gone ashore, the loungers still stood on the wharf, looking down into the boat, and began talking to one another for the men below to hear them. "They're coming in," said one, "to blow poor Blackbeard out of the water." "Aye," said another, "he's so peaceable too, he is. He'll just lay still and let 'em blow and blow, he will." "There's a young fellow there," said another of the men. "He don't look fit to die yet, he don't. Why, I wouldn't be in his place for 1,000 pound. I do suppose Blackbeard's so afraid he don't know how to see," said the first speaker. At last one of the men in the boat stood up. "Maybe he don't know how to see," said he, "but maybe we'll blow some daylight into him afore we get through with him." Some more of the settlers had come out from the shore to the end of the wharf, and there was now quite a crowd gathering there, all looking at the men in the boat. "What do them Virginia baccy eaters do down here in Caroliny anyway?" said one of the newcomers. "They got no call to be down here in North Caroliny waters. Maybe you can keep us away from comin', and maybe you can't," said a voice from the boat. "Why," answered the man on the wharf, "we could keep you away easy enough, but you bean't worth the trouble, and that's the truth." There was a heavy iron bolt lying near the edge of the landing. One of the men upon the wharf slyly thrust it out with the end of his foot. It hung for a moment, and then fell into the boat with a crash. "What do you mean by that?" roared the man in charge of the boat. "What do you mean, ye villains? Do you mean to stave a hole in us?" "Why," said the man who had pushed it, "you saw 'twasn't done on purpose, didn't you? Well, you try it again, and somebody'll get hurt," said the man in the boat, showing the butt end of his pistol. The men on the wharf began laughing. Just then the boatswain came down from the settlement again and out along the landing. The threatened turbulence quieted as he approached, and the crowd moved sullenly aside to let him pass. He did not bring any pilot with him, and he jumped down into the stern of the boat, saying briefly, "Push off." The crowd of loungers stood looking after them as they rowed away, and when the boat was some distance from the landing, they burst out into a volley of derisive yells. "The villains," said the boatswain, "they are all in league together. They wouldn't even let me go up into the settlement to look for a pilot." The lieutenant and his sailing master stood watching the boat as it approached. "Couldn't you then get a pilot, Baldwin?" said Mr. Maynard, as the boatswain scrambled aboard. "No, I couldn't, sir," said the man. "Either they all banded together, or else they're all afraid of the villains. They wouldn't even let me go up into the settlement to find one." "Well, then," said Mr. Maynard, "we'll make shift to work in as best we may by ourselves. 'Twill be high tide against 1 o'clock. We'll run in then with sail as far as we can, and then we'll send you ahead with the boat to sound for a pass, and we'll follow with the sweeps. You know the waters pretty well, you say." "They were saying ashore that the villain hath 40 men aboard," said the boatswain. Footnote: the pirate captain had really only 25 men aboard of his sloop at the time of the battle. End footnote. Lieutenant Maynard's force consisted of 35 men in the schooner and 25 men in the sloop. He carried neither cannons nor carronades, and neither of his vessels was very well fitted for the purpose for which they were designed. The schooner, which he himself commanded, offered almost no protection to the crew. The rail was not more than a foot high in the waist, and the men on the deck were almost entirely exposed. The rail of the sloop was perhaps a little higher, but it, too, was hardly better adapted for fighting. Indeed, the lieutenant depended more upon the moral force of official authority to overawe the pirates than upon any real force of arms or men. He never believed, until the very last moment, that the pirates would show any real fight. It is very possible that they might not have done so had they not thought that the lieutenant had actually no legal right supporting him in his attack upon them in North Carolina waters. It was about noon when anchor was hoisted, and, with the schooner leading, both vessels ran slowly in before a light wind that had begun to blow toward midday. In each vessel a man stood in the bows, sounding continually with lead and line. As they slowly opened up the harbor within the inlet, they could see the pirate sloop lying about 3 miles away. There was a boat just putting off from it to the shore. The lieutenant and his sailing master stood together on the roof of the cabin deck-house. The sailing master held a glass to his eye. "She carries a long gun, sir," he said, "and 4 carronades. She'll be hard to beat, sir, I do suppose, armed as we are with only light arms for close fighting." The lieutenant laughed. "Why, Brooks," he said, "you seem to think forever of these men showing fight. You don't know them as I know them. They have a deal of bluster and make a deal of noise, but when you seize them and hold them with a strong hand, there's not a fight left in them. 'Tis like enough there'll not be so much as a musket fired today. I've had to do with them often enough before to know my gentlemen well by this time." Nor, as was said, was it until the very last that the lieutenant could be brought to believe that the pirates had any stomach for a fight. The two vessels had reached perhaps within a mile of the pirate sloop before they found the water too shallow to venture any farther with the sail. It was then that the boat was lowered as the lieutenant had planned, and the boatswain went ahead to sound, the two vessels with their sails still hoisted but empty of wind, pulling in after with sweeps. The pirate had also hoisted sail, but lay as though waiting for the approach of the schooner and the sloop. The boat in which the boatswain was sounding had run in a considerable distance ahead of the two vessels, which were gradually creeping up with the sweeps until they had reached to within less than half a mile of the pirates. The boat with the boatswain may be a quarter of a mile closer. Suddenly there was a puff of smoke from the pirate sloop, and then another and another, and the next moment there came the three reports of muskets up the wind. "By zounds!" said the lieutenant, "I do believe they're firing on the boat." And then he saw the boat turn and begin pulling toward them. The boat with the boatswain aboard came rowing rapidly. Again there were 3 or 4 puffs of smoke and 3 or 4 subsequent reports from the distant vessel. Then in a little while the boat was alongside, and the boatswain came scrambling aboard. "Never mind hoisting the boat," said the lieutenant. "We'll just take her in tow. Come aboard as quick as you can." Then turning to the sailing master, "Well, Brooks, you'll have to do the best you can to get in over the shoals under half sail." "But, sir," said the master, "we'll be sure to run aground." "Very well, sir," said the lieutenant. "You heard my orders. If we run aground, we run aground, and that's all there is of it." "I sounded as far as maybe a little over a fathom," said the mate, "but the villains would let me go no nearer. I think I was in the channel, though. 'Tis more open inside as I mind me of it. There's a kind of hole there, and if we can get in over the shoals just beyond where I was, we'll be all right." "Very well, then. You take the wheel, Baldwin," said the lieutenant, "and do the best you can for us." Lieutenant Maynard stood looking out forward at the pirate vessel, which they were now steadily nearing under half sail. He could see that there were signs of bustle aboard and of men running around upon the deck. Then he walked aft and around the cabin. The sloop was some distance astern. It appeared to have run aground, and they were trying to push it off with the sweeps. The lieutenant looked down into the water over the stern, and saw that the schooner was already raising the mud in her wake. Then he went forward along the deck. His men were crouching down along by the low rail, and there was a tense quietness of expectation about them. The lieutenant looked them over as he passed them. "Johnson," he said, "do you take the lead and line and go forward and sound a bit." Then to the others, "Now, my men, the moment we run her aboard, you get aboard of her as quick as you can, do you understand? Don't wait for the sloop or think about her, but just see that the grappling irons are fast, and then get aboard. If any man offers to resist you, shoot him down. Are you ready, Mr. Kringle?" "Aye, aye, sir," said the gunner. "Very well, then. Be ready, men. We'll be aboard him in a minute or two." "There's less than a fathom of water here, sir," sang out Johnson from the bows. As he spoke there was a sudden soft jar and jerk, then the schooner was still. They were aground. "Push her off to the lee there. Let go your sheets," roared the boatswain from the wheel. "Push her off to the lee." He spun the wheel around as he spoke. A half a dozen men sprang up, seized the sweeps, and plunged them into the water. Others ran to help them, but the sweeps only sank into the mud without moving the schooner. The sails had fallen off, and they were flapping and thumping and clapping in the wind. Others of the crew had scrambled to their feet and ran to help those at the sweeps. The lieutenant had walked quickly aft again. They were very close now to the pirate sloop, and suddenly someone hailed him from aboard of her. When he turned, he saw that there was a man standing up on the rail of the pirate sloop, holding by the backstays. "Who are you?" he called from the distance. "And whence come you? What do you seek here? What do you mean, coming down on us this way?" The lieutenant heard somebody say, "That's Blackbeard hisself," and he looked with great interest at the distant figure. The pirate stood out boldly against the cloudy sky. Somebody seemed to speak to him from behind. He turned his head, and then he turned round again. "We're only peaceful merchantmen," he called out. "What authority have you got to come down upon us this way? If you'll come aboard, I'll show you my papers, and that we're only peaceful merchantmen." "The villains!" said the lieutenant to the master, who stood beside him. "They're peaceful merchantmen, are they?" "They look like peaceful merchantmen, with 4 cannonades and a long gun aboard." Then he called out across the water, "I'll come aboard with my schooner as soon as I can push her off here." "If you undertake to come aboard of me," called the pirate, "I'll shoot into you. You've got no authority to board me, and I won't have you do it. If you undertake, it will be at your own risk, for I'll neither ask quarter of you nor give none." "Very well," said the lieutenant. "If you choose to try that, you may do so as you please, for I'm coming aboard of you as sure as heaven." "Push off the bow there," called the boatswain at the wheel. "Look alive! Why don't you push off the bow?" "She's hard aground," answered the gunner. "We can't budge her an inch." "If they was to fire into us now," said the sailing master, "they'd smash us to pieces." "They won't fire into us," said the lieutenant. "They won't dare to." He jumped down from the cabin deckhouse as he spoke, and went forward to urge the men in pushing off the boat. It was already beginning to move. At that moment the sailing master suddenly called out, "Mr. Maynard! Mr. Maynard! They're going to give us a broadside!" Almost before the words were out of his mouth, before Lieutenant Maynard could turn, there came a loud and deafening crash, and then instantly another, and a third, and almost as instantly a crackling and rending of broken wood. There were clean yellow splinters flying everywhere. A man fell violently against the lieutenant, nearly overturning him, but he caught at the stays and so saved himself. For one tense moment he stood holding his breath. Then all about him arose a sudden outcry of groans and shouts and oaths. The man who had fallen against him was lying face down upon the deck. His thighs were quivering, and a pool of blood was spreading and running out from under him. There were other men down, all about the deck. Some were rising, some were trying to rise, some only moved. There was a distant sound of yelling and cheering and shouting. It was from the pirate sloop. The pirates were rushing about upon her decks. They had pulled the cannon back, and through the grunting sound of the groans about him, the lieutenant could distinctly hear the thud and punch of the rammers, and he knew they were going to shoot again. The low rail offered almost no shelter against such a broadside, and there was nothing for it but to order all hands below for the time being. "Get below!" roared out the lieutenant. "All hands get below and lie snug for further orders." In obedience, the men ran scrambling below into the hold, and in a little while the decks were nearly clear except for the 3 dead men and some 3 or 4 wounded. The boatswain crouching down close to the wheel, and the lieutenant himself were the only others upon deck. Everywhere there were smears and sprinkles of blood. "Where's Brooks?" the lieutenant cried out. "He's hurt in the arm, sir, and he's gone below," said the boatswain. Thereupon the lieutenant himself walked over to the forecastle hatch, and hailing the gunner, ordered him to get up another ladder, so that the men could be run up on deck if the pirates should undertake to come aboard. At that moment the boatswain at the wheel called out that the villains were going to shoot again, and the lieutenant, turning, saw the gunner aboard of the pirate sloop in the act of touching the iron to the touch-hole. He stooped down. There was another loud and deafening crash of cannon. 1, 2, 3, 4, the last 2 almost together, and almost instantly the boatswain called out, "'Tis the sloop, sir! Look at the sloop!" The sloop had got afloat again, and had been coming up to the aid of the schooner, when the pirates fired their second broadside now at her. When the lieutenant looked at her, she was quivering with the impact of the shot, and the next moment she began falling off to the wind, and he could see the wounded men rising and falling and struggling upon her decks. At the same moment the boatswain called out that the enemy was coming aboard, and even as he spoke the pirate sloop came drifting out from the cloud of smoke that enveloped her, looming up larger and larger as she came down upon them. The lieutenant still crouched down under the rail, looking out at them. Suddenly, a little distance away, she came about, broadside on, and then drifted. She was close aboard now. Something came flying through the air, another and another. They were bottles. One of them broke with a crash upon the deck. The others rolled over to the farther rail. In each of them a quick match was smoking. Almost instantly there was a flash and a terrific report, and the air was full of the whiz and singing of broken particles of glass and iron. There was another report, and then the whole air seemed full of gunpowder smoke. "They're aboard of us!" shouted the boatswain, and even as he spoke the lieutenant roared out, "All hands to repel boarders!" A second later there came the heavy thumping bump of the vessels coming together. Lieutenant Maynard, as he called out the order, ran forward through the smoke, snatching one of his pistols out of his pocket and the cutlass out of its sheath as he did so. Behind him the men were coming, swarming up from below. There was a sudden stunning report of a pistol, and then another and another, almost together. There was a groan and the fall of a heavy body, and then a figure came jumping over the rail, with 2 or 3 more directly following. The lieutenant was in the midst of the gunpowder smoke, when suddenly Blackbeard was before him. The pirate captain had stripped himself naked to the waist. His shaggy black hair was falling over his eyes, and he looked like a demon fresh from the pit, with his frantic face. Almost with the blindness of instinct, the lieutenant thrust out his pistol, firing it as he did so. The pirate staggered back. He was down. No, he was up again. He had a pistol in each hand, but there was a stream of blood running down his naked ribs. Suddenly the mouth of a pistol was pointing straight at the lieutenant's head. He ducked instinctively, striking upward with his cutlass as he did so. There was a stunning, deafening report almost in his ear. He struck again blindly with his cutlass. He saw the flash of a sword and flung up his guard almost instinctively, meeting the crash of the descending blade. Somebody shot from behind him, and at the same moment he saw someone else strike the pirate. Blackbeard staggered again, and this time there was a great gash upon his neck. Then one of Maynard's own men tumbled headlong upon him. He fell with the man, but almost instantly he had scrambled to his feet again, and as he did so he saw that the pirate sloop had drifted a little away from them, and that their grappling irons had evidently parted. His hand was smarting as though struck with the lash of a whip. He looked around him. The pirate captain was nowhere to be seen. Yes, there he was, lying by the rail. He raised himself upon his elbow, and the lieutenant saw that he was trying to point a pistol at him, with an arm that wavered and swayed blindly, the pistol nearly falling from his fingers. Suddenly his other elbow gave way, and he fell down upon his face. He tried to raise himself. He fell down again. There was a report and a cloud of smoke, and when it cleared away, Blackbeard had staggered up again. He was a terrible figure, his head nodding down upon his breast. Somebody shot again, and then the swaying figure toppled and fell. It lay still for a moment, then rolled over, then lay still again. There was a loud splash of men jumping overboard, and then, almost instantly, the cry of "Quarter! Quarter!" The lieutenant ran to the edge of the vessel. It was as he had thought. The grappling irons of the pirate sloop had parted, and it had drifted away. The few pirates who had been left aboard of the schooner had jumped overboard and were now holding up their hands. "Quarter!" they cried. "Don't shoot! Quarter!" And the fight was over. The lieutenant looked down at his hand, and then he saw, for the first time, that there was a great cutlass gash across the back of it, and that his arm and shirt-sleeve were wet with blood. He went aft, holding the wrist of his wounded hand. The boatswain was still at the wheel. "By zounds!" said the lieutenant, with a nervous, quavering laugh. "I didn't know there was such fight in the villains." His wounded and shattered sloop was again coming up toward him under sail, but the pirates had surrendered, and the fight was over. End of Jack Ballister's Fortunes. Blueskin, the Pirate. Subchapter 1. Cape May and Cape Henlopen form, as it were, the upper and lower jaws of a gigantic mouth, which disgorges from its monstrous gullet the cloudy waters of the Delaware Bay into the heaving, sparkling blue-green of the Atlantic Ocean. From Cape Henlopen, as the lower jaw, there juts out a long curving fang of high, smooth-rolling sand dunes, cutting sharp and clean against the still blue sky above. Silent, naked, utterly deserted, excepting for the squat, white-walled lighthouse standing upon the crest of the highest hill. Within this curving, sheltering hook of sandhills lie the smooth waters of Lewes Harbor, and, set a little back from the shore, the quaint old town, with its dingy wooden houses of clapboard and shingle, looks sleepily out through the mass of the shipping lying at anchor in the harbor, to the purple, clean-cut, level thread of the ocean horizon beyond. Lewes is a queer, odd, old-fashioned little town, smelling fragrant of salt marsh and sea breeze. It is rarely visited by strangers. The people who live there are the progeny of people who have lived there for many generations, and it is the very place to nurse and preserve and care for old legends and traditions of bygone times, until they grow from bits of gossip and news into local history of considerable size. As the busier world men talk of last year's elections, here these old bits and scraps and odds and ends of history are retailed to the listener who cares to listen. Traditions of the War of 1812, when Beresford's fleet lay off the harbor threatening to bombard the town. Tales of the Revolution and of Earl Howe's warships, tarrying for a while in the quiet harbor before they sailed up the river to shake old Philadelphia town with the thunders of their guns at Red Bank and Fort Mifflin. With these substantial and sober threads of real history, other and more lucid colors are interwoven into the web of local lore. Legends of the dark doings of famous pirates, of their mysteries, sinister comings and goings, of treasures buried in the sand dunes and pine barrens back of the Cape and along the Atlantic beach to the southward. Of such is the story of Blueskin, the pirate. Subchapter 2. It was in the fall and early winter of the year 1750, and again in the summer of the year following, that the famous pirate, Blueskin, became especially identified with Lewes as a part of its traditional history. For some time, for 3 or 4 years, rumors and reports of Blueskin's doings in the West Indies and off the Carolinas had been brought in now and then by sea captains. There was no more cruel, bloody, desperate, devilish pirate than he in all those pirate-infested waters. All kinds of wild and bloody stories were current concerning him, but it never occurred to the good folk of Lewes that such stories were some time to be a part of their own history. But one day a schooner came drifting into Lewes harbor, shattered, wounded, her forecastle splintered, her foremast shot half away, and 3 great tattered holes in her mainsail. The mate with one of the crew came ashore in the boat for help and a doctor. He reported that the captain and the cook were dead, and there were 3 wounded men aboard. The story he told to the gathering crowd brought a very peculiar thrill to those who heard it. They had fallen in with Blueskin, he said, off Fenwick's Island, some 20 or 30 miles below the Capes, and the pirates had come aboard of them, but finding that the cargo of the schooner consisted only of cypress shingles and lumber, had soon quitted their prize. Perhaps Blueskin was disappointed at not finding a more valuable capture. Perhaps the spirit of deviltry was hotter in him that morning than usual. Anyhow, as the pirate craft bore away, she fired 3 broadsides at short range into the helpless coaster. The captain had been killed at the first fire, the cook had died on the way up, 3 of the crew were wounded, and the vessel was leaking fast, betwixt wind and water. Such was the mate's story. It spread like wildfire, and in half an hour all the town was in a ferment. Fenwick's Island was very near home. Blueskin might come sailing into the harbor at any minute, and then— In an hour Sheriff Jones had called together most of the able-bodied men of the town. Muskets and rifles were taken down from the chimney places, and every preparation was made to defend the place against the pirates, should they come into the harbor and attempt to land. But Blueskin did not come that day, nor did he come the next or the next. But on the afternoon of the 3rd, the news went suddenly flying over the town that the pirates were inside the Capes. As the report spread, the people came running, men, women, and children, to the green before the tavern, where a little knot of old seamen were gathered together, looking fixedly out toward the offing, talking in low voices. 2 vessels, one bark-rigged, the other and smaller a sloop, were slowly creeping up the bay, a couple of miles or so away and just inside the Cape. There appeared nothing remarkable about the 2 crafts, but the little crowd that continued gathering upon the green stood looking out across the bay at them, none the less anxiously for that. They were sailing close-hauled to the wind, the sloop following in the wake of her consort as the pilot fish follows in the wake of the shark. But the course they held did not lie toward the harbor, but rather bore away toward the Jersey shore, and by it began to be apparent that Blueskin did not intend visiting the town. Nevertheless, those who stood looking did not draw a free breath until, after watching the 2 pirates for more than an hour and a half, they saw them, then about 6 miles away, suddenly put about and sail with a free wind out to sea again. "The bloody villains have gone," said old Captain Wolfe, shutting his telescope with a click. But Lewes was not yet quit of Blueskin. 2 days later a half-breed from Indian River Bay came up, bringing the news that the pirates had sailed into the inlet, some 15 miles below Lewes, and had careened the bark to clean her. Perhaps Blueskin did not care to stir up the country people against him, for the half-breed reported that the pirates were doing no harm, and that what they took from the farmers of Indian River and Rehoboth they paid for with good hard money. It was while the excitement over the pirates was at its highest fever heat that Levi West came home again. Subchapter 3. Even in the middle of the last century, the grist mill, a couple of miles from Lewes, although it was at most but 50 or 60 years old, had all a look of weather-beaten age, for the cypress shingles, of which it was built, ripened in a few years of wind and weather to a silvery hoary gray, and the white powdering of flour lent it a look as though the dust of ages had settled upon it, making the shadows within dim, soft, mysterious. A dozen willow trees shaded with dappling, shivering ripples of shadow the road before the mill door, and the mill itself, and the long, narrow, shingle-built, one-storied, hip-roofed dwelling-house. At the time of the story the mill had descended in a direct line of succession to Hiram White, the grandson of old Ephraim White, who had built it, it was said, in 1701. Hiram White was only 27 years old, but he was already in local repute as a character. As a boy, he was thought to be half-witted or natural, and, as is the case with such unfortunates in small country towns where everybody knows everybody, he was made a common sport and jest for the keener, crueler wits of the neighborhood. Now that he was grown to the ripeness of manhood, he was still looked upon as being, to use a quaint expression, slack, or not just right. He was heavy, awkward, ungainly, and loose-jointed, and enormously, prodigiously strong. He had a lumpish, thick-featured face, with lips heavy and loosely hanging, that gave him an air of stupidity, half droll, half pathetic. His little eyes were set far apart and flat with his face. His eyebrows were nearly white, and his hair was of a sandy, colorless kind. He was singularly taciturn, lisping thickly when he did talk, and stuttering and hesitating in his speech, as though his words moved faster than his mind could follow. It was the custom for local wags to urge or badger or tempt him to talk, for the sake of the ready laugh that always followed the few thick stammering words and the stupid drooping of the jaw at the end of each short speech. Perhaps Squire Hall was the only one in Lewes Hundred who misdoubted that Hiram was half-witted. He had had dealings with him, and was wont to say that whoever bought Hiram White for a fool made a fool's bargain. Certainly, whether he had common wits or no, Hiram had managed his mill to pretty good purpose, and was fairly well off in the world as prosperity went in southern Delaware and in those days. No doubt, had it come to the pinch, he might have bought some of his tormentors out 3 times over. Hiram White had suffered quite a financial loss some 6 months before, through that very Blueskin who was now lurking in Indian River Inlet. He had entered into a venture with Joshua Shippen, a Philadelphia merchant, to the tune of 700 pounds sterling. The money had been invested in a cargo of flour and cornmeal, which had shipped to Jamaica by the bark Nancy Lee. The Nancy Lee had been captured by the pirates off Currituck Sound, the crew set adrift in the longboat, and the bark herself and all her cargo burned to the water's edge. 500 of the 700 pounds invested in the unfortunate venture was money bequeathed by Hiram's father 7 years before to Levi West. Eliza White had been twice married, the second time to the widow West. She had brought with her to her new home a good-looking, long-legged, black-eyed, black-haired ne'er-do-well of a son, a year or so younger than Hiram. He was a shrewd, quick-witted lad, idle, shiftless, willful, ill-trained perhaps, but as bright and keen as a pin. He was the very opposite to poor, dull Hiram. Eliza White had never loved his son. He was ashamed of the poor, slack-witted oaf. Upon the other hand, he was very fond of Levi West, whom he always called our Levi, and whom he treated in every way as though he were his own son. He tried to train the lad to work in the mill, and was patient beyond what the patience of most fathers would have been with his stepson's idleness and shiftlessness. "Never mind," he used to say. "Levi'll come all right. Levi's as bright as a button." It was one of the greatest blows of the old miller's life when Levi ran away to sea. In his last sickness the old man's mind constantly turned to his lost stepson. "Maybe he'll come back again," said he, "and if he does I want you to be good to him, Hiram. I've done my duty by you and have left you the house and mill, but I want you to promise that if Levi comes back again You'll give him a home and a shelter under this roof if he wants one." And Hiram had promised to do as his father asked. After Eliezer died, it was found that he had bequeathed 500 pounds to his beloved stepson, Levi West, and had left Squire Hall as trustee. Levi West had been gone nearly 9 years, and not a word had been heard from him. There could be little or no doubt that he was dead. One day Hiram came into Squire Hall's office with a letter in his hand. It was the time of the old French War, and flour and cornmeal were fetching fabulous prices in the British West Indies. The letter Hiram brought with him was from a Philadelphia merchant, Josiah Shippen, with whom he had had some dealings. Mr. Shippen proposed that Hiram should join him in sending a venture of flour and cornmeal to Kingston, Jamaica. Hiram had slept upon the letter overnight, and now he brought it to the old squire. Squire Hall read the letter, shaking his head the while. "Too much risk, Hiram," said he. "Mr. Shippen wouldn't have asked you to go into this venture if he could have got anybody else to do so. My advice is that you let it alone. I reckon you've come to me for advice?" Hiram shook his head. "Ye haven't? What have ye come for, then?" "£700, said Hiram. £700, said Squire Hall. "I haven't got £700 to lend you, Hiram. 500 been left to Levi. I got 100. Raise 100 more on mortgage," said Hiram. "Tut, tut, Hiram," said Squire Hall. "That'll never do in the world. Suppose Levi West should come back again. What then? I am responsible for that money. If you wanted to borrow it now for any reasonable venture, you should have it and welcome. But for such a wildcat scheme—" "Levi never come back," said Hiram. 9 years gone. Levi's dead." "Maybe he is," said Squire Hall, "but we don't know that." "I'll give bond for security," said Hiram. Squire Hall thought for a while in silence. "Very well, Hiram," said he by and by, "if you'll do that. Your father left the money, and I don't see that it's right for me to stay his son from using it. But if it is lost, Hiram, and if Levi should come back, it will go well to ruin ye." So Hiram White invested £700 in the Jamaica venture, and every farthing of it was burned by Blueskin, off Currituck Sound. Subchapter 4. Sally Martin was said to be the prettiest girl in Lewes Hundred, and when the rumor began to leak out that Hiram White was courting her, the whole community took it as a monstrous joke. It was the common thing to greet Hiram himself with, "Hey, Hiram, how's Sally?" Hiram never made answer to such salutation, but went his way as heavily, as impassively, as dully as ever. The joke was true. Twice a week, rain or shine, Hiram White never failed to scrape his feet upon Billy Martin's doorstep. Twice a week, on Sundays and Thursdays, he never failed to make his customary seat by the kitchen fire. He rarely said anything by way of talk. He nodded to the farmer, to his wife, to Sally, and, when he chanced to be at home, to her brother, but he ventured nothing further. There he would sit from 7:30 until 9 o'clock, stolid, heavy, impassive, his dull eyes following now one of the family and now another, but always coming back again to Sally. It sometimes happened that she had other company, some of the young men of the neighborhood. The presence of such seemed to make no difference to Hiram. He bore whatever broad jokes might be cracked upon him, whatever grins, whatever giggling might follow those jokes, with the same patient impassiveness. There he would sit, silent, unresponsive. Then, at the first stroke of 9 o'clock, he would rise, shoulder his ungainly person into his overcoat, twist his head into his three-cornered hat, and with a "Good night, Sally, I be goin' now," would take his departure, shutting the door carefully to behind him. Never perhaps was there a girl in the world had such a lover and such a courtship as Sally Martin. Subchapter 5. It was one Thursday evening, in the latter part of November, about a week after Blueskin's appearance off the Capes, and while the one subject of talk was of the pirates being in Indian River Inlet. The air was still and wintry. A sudden cold snap had set in, and skins of ice had formed over puddles in the road. The smoke from the chimneys rose straight in the quiet air, and voices sounded loud, as they do in frosty weather. Hiram White sat by the dim light of a tallow dip, poring laboriously over some account books. It was not quite 7 o'clock, and he never started for Billy Martin's before that hour. As he ran his fingers slowly and hesitantly down the column of figures, he heard the kitchen door beyond open and shut, the noise of footsteps crossing the floor, and the scraping of a chair dragged forward to the hearth. Then came the sound of a basket of corn cobs being emptied on the smoldering blaze, and then the snapping and crackling of the reanimated fire. Hiram thought nothing of all this, excepting, in a dim sort of way, that it was Bob, the negro mill hand, or old black Dinah, the housekeeper, and so went on with his calculations. At last he closed the books with a snap, and, smoothing down his hair, arose, took up the candle, and passed out of the room into the kitchen beyond. A man was sitting in front of the corncob fire that flamed and blazed in the great, gaping, sooty fireplace. A rough overcoat was flung over the chair behind him, and his hands were spread out to the roaring warmth. At the sound of the lifted latch and of Hiram's entrance, he turned his head, and when Hiram saw his face, he stood suddenly still as though turned to stone. The face, marvelously altered and changed as it was the face of his stepbrother, Levi West. He was not dead. He had come home again. For a time not a sound broke the dead, unbroken silence, excepting the crackling of the blaze in the fireplace and the sharp tickling of the tall clock in the corner. The one face, dull and stolid, with the light of the candle shining upward over its lumpy features, looked fixedly, immovably, stonily at the other, sharp, shrewd, cunning, the red wavering light of the blaze shining upon the high cheekbones, cutting sharp on the nose and twinkling in the glassy turn of the black, rat-like eyes. Then suddenly that face cracked, broadened, spread to a grin. "I have come back again, Hi," said Levi, and at the sound of the words the speechless spell was broken. Hiram answered never a word, but he walked to the fireplace, set the candle down upon the dusty mantel-shelf among the boxes and bottles, and, drawing forward a chair upon the other side of the hearth, sat down. His dull little eyes never moved from his stepbrother's face. There was no curiosity in his expression, no surprise, no wonder. The heavy under lip drooped a little farther open, and there was more than usual of dull, expressionless stupidity upon the lumpish face, but that was all. As was said, the face upon which he looked was strangely, marvelously changed from what it had been when he had last seen it 9 years before, and though it was still the face of Levi West, it was a very different Levi West than the shiftless ne'er-do-well who had run away to sea in the Brazilian brig that long time ago. That Levi West had been a rough, careless, happy-go-lucky fellow, thoughtless and selfish, but with nothing essentially evil or sinister in his nature. The Levi West that now sat in the rush-bottom chair at the other side of the fireplace had that stamped upon his front that might be both evil and sinister. His swart complexion was tanned to an Indian copper. On one side of his face was a curious discoloration in the skin and a long, crooked, cruel scar that ran diagonally across the forehead and temple and cheek in a white, jagged seam. This discoloration was of a livid blue, about the tint of a tattoo mark. It made a patch the size of a man's hand, lying across the cheek and the side of the neck. Hiram could not keep his eyes from this mark and the white scar cutting across it. There was an odd sort of incongruity in Levi's dress. A pair of heavy gold earrings and a dirty red handkerchief knotted loosely around his neck beneath an open collar, displaying to its full length the lean, sinewy throat with its bony Adam's apple, gave to his costume somewhat the smack of a sailor. He wore a coat that had once been of fine plum color, now stained and faded, too small for his lean length, and furbished with tarnished lace. Dirty cambric cuffs hung at his wrists, and on his fingers were half a dozen or more rings, set with stones that shone and glistened, and twinkled in the light of the fire. The hair at either temple was twisted into a Spanish curl, plastered flat to the cheek, and a plaited queue hung halfway down his back. Hiram, speaking never a word, sat motionless, his dull little eyes traveling slowly up and down and around his stepbrother's person. Levi did not seem to notice his scrutiny, leaning forward, now with his palms spread out to the grateful warmth, now rubbing them slowly together. But at last he suddenly whirled his chair around, rasping on the floor, and faced his stepbrother. He thrust his hands into his capacious coat pocket and brought out a pipe, which he proceeded to fill from a skin of tobacco. "Well, hi," said he. "Do ye see I've come back home again?" "Thought you was dead," said Hiram dully. Levi laughed. Then he drew a red-hot coal out of the fire, put it upon the bowl of the pipe, and began puffing out clouds of pungent smoke. "Nay, nay," said he, not dead by odds. "But," puff, "by the eternal holy, I played many a close game, puff, with old Davy Jones, for all that." Hiram's look turned inquiringly toward the jagged scar, and Levi caught the slow glance. "You're looking at this," said he, running his finger down the crooked seam. "That looks bad, but it wasn't so close as this," laying his hand for a moment upon the livid stain. "A coolie devil off Singapore gave me that cut when we fell foul of an opium junk in the China Sea 4 years ago last September. This," touching the disfiguring blue patch again, "was a closer miss, Hi. A Spanish captain fired a pistol at me down off Santa Catharina. He was so nigh that the powder went under the skin, and it'll never come out again. His eyes, he had better have fired the pistol into his own head that morning. But never mind that. I reckon I'm changed, ain't I, Hi?" He took his pipe out of his mouth and looked inquiringly at Hiram, who nodded. Levi laughed. "Never doubt it," said he, "but whether I'm changed or no, I'll take my affidavy that you are the same old half-witted Hi that you used to be. I remember Dad used to say that you hadn't no more than enough wits to keep you out of the rain. And, talking of Dad, Hi, I hearn tell he's been dead now these 9 years gone. Do ye know what I've come home for?" Hiram shook his head. "I've come for that £500 that Dad left me when he died, for I hearn tell of that, too." Hiram sat quite still for a second or two, and then he said, "I put that money out to venture and lost it all." Levi's face fell, and he took his pipe out of his mouth, regarding Hiram sharply and keenly. "What do you mean?" said he presently. "I thought you was dead, and I put £700 into Nancy Lee, and Blueskin burned her off Currituck." "Burned her off Currituck," repeated Levi. Then suddenly a light seemed to break upon his comprehension. "Burned by Blueskin," he repeated, and thereupon flung himself back in his chair and burst into a short, boisterous fit of laughter. "Well, by the Holy Eternal, Hi, if that isn't a piece of your tarnal luck! Burned by Blueskin, was it?" He paused for a moment, as though turning it over in his mind. Then he laughed again. "All the same," said he presently, "d'ye see, I can't suffer for Blueskin's doings. The money was willed to me, fair and true, and you have got to pay it, Hiram White, burn or sink, Blueskin or no Blueskin." Again he puffed for a moment or two in reflective silence. "All the same, Hi," said he, once more resuming the thread of talk, "I don't reckon to be too hard on you. You be only half-witted anyway, and I shan't be too hard on you. I give you a month to raise that money, and while you're doing it, I'll just hang around here. I've been in trouble, Hi, d'ye see. I'm under a cloud, and so I want to keep here, as quiet as may be. I'll tell ye how it came about. I had a set-to with a land pirate in Philadelphia, and somebody got hurt. That's the reason I'm here now, and don't you say anything about it. Do you understand?" Hiram opened his lips as though it was his intent to answer, then seemed to think better of it, and contented himself by nodding his head. That Thursday night was the first for a 6 month that Hiram White did not scrape his feet clean at Billy Martin's doorstep. Subchapter 6. Within a week, Levi West had pretty well established himself among his old friends and acquaintances, though upon a different footing from that of 9 years before, for this was a very different Levi from that other. Nevertheless, he was none the less popular in the bar-room of the tavern and at the country store, where he was always the center of a group of loungers. His 9 years seemed to have been crowded full of the wildest of wild adventures and happenings, as well by land as by sea, and, given an appreciative audience, he would reel off his yarns by the hour, in a reckless, devil-may-care fashion that set agape even old sea-dogs who had sailed the western ocean since boyhood. Then he seemed always to have plenty of money, and he loved to spend it at the tavern tap-room, with a lavishness that was at once the wonder and admiration of gossips. At that time, as was said, Blueskin was the one engrossing topic of talk, and it added not a little to Levi's prestige when it was found that he had actually often seen that bloody devilish pirate with his own eyes. A great, heavy, burly fellow, Levi said he was, with a beard as black as a hat. A devil with his sword and pistol afloat, but not so black as he was painted when ashore. He told of many adventures in which Blueskin figured and was then always listened to with more than usual gaping interest. As for Blueskin, the quiet way in which the pirates conducted themselves at Indian River almost made the loose folk forget what he could do when the occasion called. They almost ceased to remember that poor shattered schooner that had crawled with its ghastly dead and groaning wounded into the harbor a couple of weeks since. But if for a while they forgot who or what Blueskin was, it was not for long. One day a bark from Bristol, bound for Cuba and laden with a valuable cargo of cloth stuffs and silks, put into Lewes harbor to take in water. The captain himself came ashore and was at the tavern for 2 or 3 hours. It happened that Levi was there and that the talk was of Blueskin. The English captain, a grizzled old sea-dog, listened to Levi's yarns with not a little contempt. He had, he said, sailed in the China Sea and the Indian Ocean too long to be afraid of any hog-eating Yankee pirate such as this Blueskin. A junk full of coolies armed with stink-pots was something to speak of, but who ever heard of the likes of Blueskin falling afoul of anything more than a Spanish canoe or a Yankee coaster? Levi grinned. "All the same, my hearty," said he, "if I was you I'd give Blueskin a wide berth. I hear that he's cleaned the vessel that was careened a while ago, and maybe he'll give you a little trouble if you come too nigh him." To this the Englishman only answered that Blueskin might be blank, and that the next afternoon, wind and weather permitting, he intended to heave anchor and run out to sea. Levi laughed again. "I wish I might be here to see what'll happen," said he, "but I'm going up the river tonight to see a gal, and maybe won't be back again for 3 or 4 days." The next afternoon the English bark set sail as the captain promised, and that night Lewes town was awake until almost morning, gazing at a broad red glare that lighted up the sky away toward the southeast. 2 days afterward a negro oysterman came up from Indian River with news that the pirates were lying off the inlet, bringing ashore bales of goods from their larger vessel and piling the same upon the beach under tarpaulins. He said that it was known down at Indian River that Blueskin had fallen afoul of an English bark, had burned her, and had murdered the captain and all but 3 of the crew, who had joined with the pirates. The excitement over this terrible happening had only begun to subside when another occurred to cap it. One afternoon a ship's boat, in which were 5 men and 2 women, came rowing into Lewes harbor. It was the longboat of the Charleston packet, bound for New York, and was commanded by the first mate. The packet had been attacked and captured by the pirates about 10 leagues south by east of Cape Henlopen. The pirates had come aboard of them at night, and no resistance had been offered. Perhaps it was this circumstance that saved the lives of all, for no murder or violence had been done. Nevertheless, officers, passengers, and crew had been stripped of everything of value and set adrift in the boats, and the ship herself had been burned. The longboat had become separated from the others during the night, and had sighted Henlopen a little after sunrise. It might be here said that Squire Hall made out a report of these 2 occurrences and sent it up to Philadelphia by the mate of the packet. But for some reason it was nearly 4 weeks before a sloop of war was sent around from New York. In the meanwhile, the pirates had disposed of the booty stored under the tarpaulins on the beach at Indian River Inlet, shipping some of it away in 2 small sloops, and sending the rest by wagons somewhere up the country. Subchapter 7. Levi had told the English captain that he was going up country to visit one of his lady friends. He was gone nearly 2 weeks. Then once more he appeared as suddenly, as unexpectedly, as he had done when he first returned to Lewes. Hiram was sitting at supper when the door opened and Levi walked in, hanging up his hat behind the door as unconcernedly as though he had only been gone an hour. He was in an ugly, lowering humor, and sat himself down at the table without uttering a word, resting his chin upon his clenched fist and glowering fixedly at the corn cake, while Dinah fetched him a plate and knife and fork. His coming seemed to have taken away all of Hiram's appetite. He pushed away his plate and sat staring at his stepbrother, who presently fell to at the bacon and eggs like a famished wolf. Not a word was said until Levi had ended his meal and filled his pipe. "Look'ee, Hiram," said he, as he stooped over the fire and raked out a hot coal. "Look'ee, Hiram, I've been to Philadelphia, d'ye see, a settlin' up that trouble I told you about when I first came home. D'ye understand? D'ye remember? D'ye get it through your skull?" He looked around over his shoulder, waiting as though for an answer, but getting none, he continued, "I expect two gentlemen here from Philadelphia tonight. They're friends of mine, and are coming to talk over the business, and ye needn't stay at home, Hi. You can go out somewhere, d'ye understand?" And then he added with a grin, "Ye can go see Sally." Hiram pushed back his chair and arose. He leaned with his back against the side of the fireplace. "I'll stay at home," said he presently. "But I don't want you to stay at home, Hi," said Levi. "We'll have to talk business, and I want you to go." "I'll stay at home," said Hiram again. Levi's brow grew as black as thunder. He ground his teeth together, and for a moment or two it seemed as though an explosion was coming. But he swallowed his passion with a gulp. "You're a pig-headed, half-witted fool," said he. Hiram never so much as moved his eyes. "As for you," said Levi, whirling round upon Dinah, who was clearing the table, and glorying balefully upon the old negress, "you put them things down and git out of here. Don't you come nigh this kitchen again till I tell ye to. If I catch you pryin' around, may I be blank, eyes and liver, if I don't cut your heart out." In about half an hour Levi's friends came. The first a little, thin, wizened man, with a very foreign look. He was dressed in a rusty black suit, and wore gray yarn stockings and shoes with brass buckles. The other was also plainly a foreigner. He was dressed in sailor fashion, with petticoat breeches of duck, a heavy pea jacket, and thick boots reaching to the knees. He wore a red sash tied around his waist, and once, as he pushed back his coat, Hiram saw the glitter of a pistol butt. He was a powerful, thick-set man, low-browed and bull-necked, his cheek and chin and throat closely covered with a stubble of blue-black beard. He wore a red kerchief tied around his head, and over it a cocked hat, edged with tarnished gilt braid. Levi himself opened the door to them. He exchanged a few words outside with his visitors, in a foreign language of which Hiram understood nothing. Neither of the two strangers spoke a word to Hiram. The little man shot him a sharp look out of the corners of his eyes, and the burly ruffian scowled blackly at him, but beyond that neither vouchsafed him any regard. Levi drew to the shutters, shut the bolt in the outer door, and tilted a chair against the latch of the one that led from the kitchen into the adjoining room. Then the three worthies seated themselves at the table which Dinah had half cleared of the supper china, and were presently deeply engrossed over a packet of papers which the big burly man had brought with him in the pocket of his pea jacket. The confabulation was conducted throughout in the same foreign language which Levi had used when first speaking to them, a language quite unintelligible to Hiram's ears. Now and then the murmur of talk would rise loud and harsh over some disputed point. Now and then it would sink away to whispers. Twice the tall clock in the corner whirred and sharply struck the hour, but throughout the whole long consultation Hiram stood silent, motionless as a stock, his eyes fixed almost unwinkingly upon the three heads grouped close together around the dim, flickering light of the candle and the papers scattered upon the table. Suddenly the talk came to an end, the three heads separated, and the three chairs were pushed back, grating harshly. Levi rose, went to the closet, and brought thence a bottle of Hiram's apple brandy, as coolly as though it belonged to himself. He set 3 tumblers and a crock of water upon the table, and each helped himself liberally. As the 2 visitors departed down the road, Levi stood for a while at the open door, looking after the dusky figures until they were swallowed in the darkness. Then he turned, came in, shut the door, shuddered, took a final dose of the apple brandy, and went to bed, without, since his first suppressed explosion, having said a single word to Hiram. Hiram, left alone, stood for a while, silent, motionless as ever. Then he looked slowly about him, gave a shake of the shoulders as though to arouse himself, and taking the candle, left the room, shutting the door noiselessly behind him. Subchapter 8. This time of Levi West's unwelcome visitation was indeed a time of bitter trouble and tribulation to poor Hiram White. Money was of very different value in those days than it is now, and £500 was in its way a good round lump. In Sussex County it was almost a fortune. It was a desperate struggle for Hiram to raise the amount of his father's bequest to his stepbrother. Squire Hall, as may have been gathered, had a very warm and friendly feeling for Hiram, believing in him when all others disbelieved. Nevertheless, in the matter of money, the old man was as hard and as cold as adamant. He would, he said, do all he could to help Hiram, but that £500 must and should be raised. Hiram must release his security bond. He would loan him, he said, £300, taking a mortgage upon the mill. He would have lent him £400, but that there was already a first mortgage of £100 upon it, and he would not dare to put more than £300 more on top of that. Hiram had a considerable quantity of wheat, which he had bought upon speculation, and which was then lying idle in a Philadelphia storehouse. This he had sold at public sale, and at a very great sacrifice. He realized barely £100 upon it. The financial horizon looked very black to him. Nevertheless, Levi's £500 was raised and paid into Squire Hall's hands, and Squire Hall released Hiram's bond. The business was finally closed on one cold gray afternoon in the early part of December. As Hiram tore his bond across and then tore it across again and again, Squire Hall pushed back the papers upon his desk and cocked his feet upon its slanting top. "Hiram," said he abruptly, "Hiram, do you know that Levi West is forever hanging around Billy Martin's house after that pretty daughter of his?" So long a space of silence followed the speech that the squire began to think that Hiram might not have heard him. But Hiram had heard. "No," said he, "I didn't know it." "Well, he is," said Squire Hall. "It's the talk of the whole neighborhood. The talk's pretty bad, too. Do ye know that they say that she was away from home 3 days last week, nobody knew where? The fellows turned her head with his sailor's yarns and his traveler's lies." Hiram said not a word, but he sat looking at the other in stolid silence. "That stepbrother of yours," continued the old squire presently, "is a rascal. He is a rascal, Hiram, and I misdoubt he's something worse. I hear he's been seen in some queer places and with queer company of late." He stopped again, and still Hiram said nothing. "And look'ee, Hiram," the old man resumed, suddenly, "I do hear that you be courting the girl too. Is that so?" "Yes," said Hiram, "I'm courting her too." "Tut, tut," said the squire. "That's a pity, Hiram. I'm afraid your cakes are dough." After he had left the squire's office, Hiram stood for a while in the street, bareheaded, his hat in his hand, staring unwinkingly down at the ground at his feet, with stupidly drooling lips and lackluster eyes. Presently he raised his hand and began slowly smoothing down the sandy shock of hair upon his forehead. At last he aroused himself with a shake, looked dully up and down the street, and then, putting on his hat, turned and walked slowly and heavily away. The early dusk of the cloudy winter evening was settling fast, for the sky was leaden and threatening. At the outskirts of the town Hiram stopped again and again stood for a while in brooding thought. Then finally he turned slowly, not the way that led homeward, but taking the road that led between the bare and withered fields and crooked fences toward Billy Martin's. It would be hard to say just what it was that led Hiram to seek Billy Martin's house at that time of day, whether it was fate or ill fortune. He could not have chosen a more opportune time to confirm his own undoing. What he saw was the very worst that his heart feared. Along the road, at a little distance from the house, was a mock orange hedge, now bare, naked, leafless. As Hiram drew near he heard footsteps approaching and low voices. He drew back into the fence corner, and there stood, half sheltered by the stark network of twigs. 2 figures passed slowly along the gray of the roadway in the gloaming. One was his stepbrother, the other was Sally Martin. Levi's arm was around her. He was whispering into her ear, and her head rested upon his shoulder. Hiram stood as still, as breathless, as cold as ice. They stopped upon the side of the road just beyond where he stood. Hiram's eyes never left them. There for some time they talked together in low voices, their words now and then reaching the ears of that silent, breathless listener. Suddenly there came the clattering of an opening door, and then Betty Martin's voice broke the silence, harshly, shrilly. "Sal? Sal? Sally Martin! You, Sally Martin! Come in here! Where be ye?" The girl flung her arms around Levi's neck, and their lips met in one quick kiss. The next moment she was gone, flying swiftly, silently, down the road past where Hiram stood, stooping as she ran. Levi stood looking after her until she was gone, then he turned and walked away whistling. His whistling died shrilly into silence in the wintry distance, and then at last Hiram came stumbling out from the hedge. His face had never looked before as it looked then. Subchapter 9. Hiram was standing in front of the fire with his hands clasped behind his back. He had not touched the supper on the table. Levi was eating with an appetite. Suddenly he looked over his plate at his stepbrother. "How about that 500 pounds, Hiram?" said he. "I gave ye a month to raise it, and the month ain't quite up yet, but I'm going to leave this here place day after tomorrow, by next day at the furthest, and I want the money that's mine. I paid it to Squire Hall today, and he has it for ye," said Hiram dully. Levi laid down his knife and fork with a clatter. "Squire Hall," said he. "What's Squire Hall got to do with it? Squire Hall didn't have the use of that money. It was you had it, and you have got to pay it back to me. And if you don't do it, by gee, I'll have the law on you, sure as you're born." "Squire Hall's trustee. I ain't your trustee," said Hiram in the same dull voice. "I don't know nothing about trustees," said Levi, "or anything about lawyer business either. What I want to know is, are you going to pay me my money or no?" "No," said Hiram, "I ain't. Squire Hall'll pay ye. You go to him." Levi West's face grew purple red. He pushed back, his chair grating harshly. "You bloody land pirate," he said, grinding his teeth together. "I see through your tricks. You're up to cheating me out of my money. You know very well that Squire Hall is down on me, hard and bitter, writing his blank reports to Philadelphia, and doing all he can to stir up everybody agin me and to bring the Blue Jackets down on me. I see through your tricks as clear as glass, but ye shan't trick me. I'll have my money if there's law in the land, ye bloody, unnatural thief ye, who'd go agin your dead father's will." Then, if the roof had fallen in upon him, Levi West could not have been more amazed. Hiram suddenly strode forward, and leaning half across the table with his fists clenched, fairly glared into Levi's eyes. His face, dull, stupid, wooden, was now fairly convulsed with passion. The great veins stood out upon his temples like knotted whipcords, and when he spoke, his voice was more a breathless snarl than the voice of a Christian man. "Ye'll have the law, will ye?" said he. "Ye'll have the law, will ye? You're afeard to go to law, Levi West. You try the law, and see how ye like it. Who're ye to call me thief, ye bloody murderin' villain ye? You're the thief, Levi West. You come here and stole my daddy from me, ye did. Ye make me ruin myself to pay outer to been mine. Then ye steal the gal I was courtin' to boot." He stopped, and his lips writhed for words to say. "I know ye," said he, grinding his teeth. "I know ye, and only for what my daddy made me promise, I'd a had you up to the magistrates before this." Then, pointing with quivering finger, "There's the door, you see it. Go out that there door and don't never come into it again. If ye do, or if ye ever come where I can lay eyes upon ye again, by the holy holy, I'll hale ye up to the squire's office and tell all I know and all I've seen. Oh, I'll give ye your belly full of law if ye want the law. Get out of the house, I say." As Hiram spoke, Levi seemed to shrink together. His face changed from its copper color to a dull, waxy yellow. When the other ended, he answered never a word, but he pushed back his chair, rose, put on his hat, and, with a furtive, sidelong look, left the house, without stopping to finish the supper which he had begun. He never entered Hiram White's door again. Subchapter 10. Hiram had driven out the evil spirit from his home, but the mischief that it had brewed was done and could not be undone. The next day it was known that Sally Martin had run away from home, and that she had run away with Levi West. Old Billy Martin had been in town in the morning with his rifle, hunting for Levi, and threatening if he caught him to have his life for leading his daughter astray. And as the evil spirit had left Hiram's house, so had another and a greater evil spirit quitted its harborage. It was heard from Indian River in a few days more that Blueskin had quitted the inlet and had sailed away to the southeast, and it was reported, by those who seemed to know, that he had finally quitted those parts. It was well for himself that Blueskin left when he did, for not 3 days after he sailed away, the Scorpion sloop of war dropped anchor in Lewes Harbor. The New York agent of the unfortunate packet and a government commissioner had also come aboard the Scorpion. Without loss of time, the officer in command instituted a keen and searching examination that brought to light some singularly curious facts. It was found that a very friendly understanding must have existed for some time between the pirates and the people of Indian River, for in the houses throughout that section many things, some of considerable value, that had been taken by the pirates from the packet were discovered and seized by the commissioner. Valuables of a suspicious nature that had found way even into the houses of Lewes itself. The whole neighborhood seemed to have become more or less tainted by the presence of the pirates. Even poor Hiram White did not escape the suspicions of having had dealings with them. Of course, the examiners were not slow in discovering that Levi West had been deeply concerned with Blueskin's doings. Old Dinah and Black Bob were examined, and not only did the story of Levi's 2 visitors come to light, but also the fact that Hiram was present and with them while they were in the house disposing of the captured goods to their agent. Of all that he had endured, nothing seemed to cut poor Hiram so deeply and keenly as these unjust suspicions. They seemed to bring the last bitter pang, hardest of all to bear. Levi had taken from him his father's love. He had driven him, if not to ruin, at least perilously close to it. He had run away with the girl he loved, and now, through him, even Hiram's good name was gone. Neither did the suspicions against him remain passive. They became active. Goldsmith's bills, to the amount of several £1,000s, had been taken in the packet, and Hiram was examined with an almost inquisitorial closeness and strictness as to whether he had or had not knowledge of their whereabouts. Under his accumulated misfortunes, he grew not only more dull, more taciturn than ever, but gloomy, moody, brooding as well. For hours he would sit staring straight before him into the fire, without moving so much as a hair. One night, it was a bitterly cold night in February, with 3 inches of dry and gritty snow upon the ground, when Hiram sat thus brooding, there came of a sudden a soft tap upon the door. Low and hesitating as it was, Hiram started violently at the sound. He sat for a while, looking from right to left. Then suddenly pushing back his chair, he arose, strode to the door, and flung it wide open. It was Sally Martin. Hiram stood for a while staring blankly at her. It was she who first spoke. "Won't you let me come in, Hi?" said she. "I'm nigh starved with the cold, and I'm fit to die. I'm so hungry. For God's sake, let me come in." "Yes," said Hiram, "I'll let you come in. But why don't you go home?" The poor girl was shivering and chattering with the cold. Now she began crying, wiping her eyes with the corner of a blanket in which her head and shoulders were wrapped. "I have been home, Hiram," she said. "But Dad, he shut the door in my face. He cursed me just awful, Hi. I wish I was dead." "You better come in," said Hiram. "It's no good standing out there in the cold." He stood aside, and the girl entered, swiftly, gratefully. At Hiram's bidding, Black Dinah presently set some food before Sally, and she fell to eating ravenously, almost ferociously. Meantime, while she ate, Hiram stood with his back to the fire, looking at her face, that face once so round and rosy, now thin, pinched, haggard. "Are you sick, Sally?" said he presently. "No," said she, "but I've had pretty hard times since I left home, Hi." The tears sprang to her eyes at the recollection of her troubles, but she only wiped them hastily away with the back of her hand, without stopping in her eating. A long pause of dead silence followed. Dinah sat crouched together on a cricket on the other side of the hearth, listening with interest. Hiram did not seem to see her. "Did you go off with Levi?" said he at last, speaking abruptly. The girl looked up furtively under her brows. "You needn't be afeard to tell," he added. "Yes," said she at last, "I did go off with him, Hi." "Where have you been?" At the question she suddenly laid down her knife and fork. "Don't you ask that. Don't you ask me that, Hi," she said agitatedly. "I can't tell you that. You don't know Levi, Hiram. I daren't tell you anything he don't want me to. If I told you where I been he'd hunt me out, no matter where I was, and kill me. If you only knew what I know about him, Hiram, you wouldn't ask anything about him." Hiram stood looking brutally at her for a long time. Then at last he spoke again. "I thought a sight of you once, Sally," said he. Sally did not answer immediately, but after a while she suddenly looked up. "Hiram," said she, "if I tell ye something, will you promise on your oath not to breathe a word to any living soul?" Hiram nodded. "Then I'll tell you, but if Levi finds I've told you, he'll murder me as sure as you're standing there. Come nigher, I've got to whisper it." He leaned forward close to her where she sat. She looked swiftly from right to left, then raising her lips, she breathed into his ear. "I'm an honest woman, Hi. I was married to Levi West before I run away." Subchapter 11. The winter had passed, spring had passed, and summer had come. Whatever Hiram had felt, he had made no sign of suffering. Nevertheless, his lumpy face had begun to look flabby, his cheeks hollow, and his loose-jointed body shrunk more awkwardly together into its clothes. He was often awake at night, sometimes walking up and down his room until far into the small hours. It was through such a wakeful spell as this that he entered into the greatest, the most terrible, happening of his life. It was a sulphurously hot night in July. The air was like the breath of a furnace, and it was a hard matter to sleep with even the easiest mind and under the most favorable circumstances. The full moon shone in through the open window, laying a white square of light upon the floor, and Hiram, as he paced up and down, walked directly through it, his gaunt figure starting out at every turn into sudden brightness as he entered the straight line of misty light. The clock in the kitchen whirred and rang out the hour of 12, and Hiram stopped in his walk to count the strokes. The last vibration died away into silence, and still he stood motionless, now listening with a new and sudden intentness, for, even as the clock rang the last stroke, he heard soft, heavy footsteps moving slowly and cautiously along the pathway before the house and directly below the open window. A few seconds more, and he heard the creaking of rusty hinges. The mysterious visitor had entered the mill. Hiram crept softly to the window and looked out. The moon shone full on the dusty, shingled face of the old mill, not 30 steps away, and he saw that the door was standing wide open. A second or two of stillness followed, and then, as he stood looking intently, he saw the figure of a man suddenly appear, sharp and vivid, from the gaping blackness of the open doorway. Hiram could see his face as clear as day. It was Levi West, and he carried an empty meal bag over his arm. Levi West stood looking from right to left for a second or two, and then he took off his hat and wiped his brow with the back of his hand. Then he softly closed the door behind him and left the mill as he had come, and with the same cautious step. Hiram looked down upon him as he passed close to the house and almost directly beneath. He could have touched him with his hand. 50 or 60 yards from the house, Levi stopped, and a second figure arose from the black shadow in the angle of the worm fence and joined him. They stood for a while talking together, Levi pointing now and then toward the mill. Then the two turned, and climbing over the fence, cut across an open field and through the tall, shaggy grass toward the southeast. Hiram straightened himself and drew a deep breath, and the moon, shining full upon his face, showed it twisted, convulsed, as it had been when he had fronted his stepbrother 7 months before in the kitchen. Great beads of sweat stood on his brow, and he wiped them away with his sleeve. Then, coatless, hatless as he was, he swung himself out of the window, dropped upon the grass, and without an instant of hesitation, strode off down the road in the direction that Levi West had taken. As he climbed the fence where the two men had climbed it, he could see them in the pallid light, far away across the level, scrubby meadowland, walking toward a narrow strip of pine woods. A little later they entered the sharp-cut shadows beneath the trees and were swallowed in the darkness. With fixed eyes and closed-shut lips, as doggedly, as inexorably as though he were a nemesis hunting his enemy down, Hiram followed their footsteps across the stretch of moonlit open. Then, by and by, He also was in the shadow of the pines. Here not a sound broke the midnight hush. His feet made no noise upon the resinous softness of the ground below. In that dead, pulseless silence he could distinctly hear the distant voices of Levi and his companion, sounding loud and resonant in the hollow of the woods. Beyond the woods was a cornfield, and presently he heard the rattling of the harsh leaves as the two plunged into the tasseled jungle. Here, as in the woods, he followed them, step by step, guided by the noise of their progress through the canes. Beyond the cornfield ran a road that, skirting to the south of Lewes, led across a wooden bridge to the wide salt marshes that stretched between the town and the distant sandhills. Coming out upon this road, Hiram found that he had gained upon those he followed, and that they now were not 50 paces away, and he could see that Levi's companion carried over his shoulder what looked like a bundle of tools. He waited for a little while to let them gain their distance, and for the second time wiped his forehead with his shirt sleeve. Then, without ever once letting his eyes leave them, he climbed the fence to the roadway. For a couple of miles or more he followed the two along the white level highway, past silent, sleeping houses, past barns, sheds, and haystacks looming big in the moonlight, past fields and woods and clearings, past the dark and silent skirts of the town, and so at last out upon the wide misty salt marshes, which seemed to stretch away interminably through the pallid light, yet were bounded in the far distance by the long white line of sand hills. Across the level salt marshes he followed them, through the rank sedge and past the glossy pools in which his own inverted image stalked beneath as he stalked above. On and on, until at last they had reached a belt of scrub pines, gnarled and gray, that fringed the foot of the white sand hills. Here Hiram kept within the black network of shadow. The two whom he followed walked more in the open, with their shadows, as black as ink, walking along in the sand beside them, and now, in the dead, breathless stillness, might be heard, chill and heavy, the distant thumping, pounding roar of the Atlantic surf, beating on the beach at the other side of the sandhills, half a mile away. At last the two rounded the southern end of the white bluff, and when Hiram, following, rounded it also, they were no longer to be seen. Before him the sandhill rose, smooth and steep, cutting in a sharp ridge against the sky. Up this steep hill trailed the footsteps of those he followed, disappearing over the crest. Beyond the ridge lay a round, bowl-like hollow, perhaps 50 feet across and 18 or 20 feet deep, scooped out by the eddying of the winds into an almost perfect circle. Hiram, slowly, cautiously, stealthily, followed their trailing line of footmarks, mounted to the top of the hillock, and peered down into the bowl beneath. The two men were sitting upon the sand, not far from the tall, skeleton-like shaft of a dead pine tree that rose, stark and gray, from the sand in which it may once have been buried centuries ago. Subchapter 12. Levi had taken off his coat and waistcoat and was fanning himself with his hat. He was sitting upon the bag he had brought from the mill, and which he had spread out upon the sand. His companion sat facing him. The moon shone full upon him, and Hiram knew him instantly. He was the same burly, forley-looking ruffian who had come with the little man to the mill that night to see Levi. He also had his hat off, and was wiping his forehead and face with a red handkerchief. Beside him lay the bundle of tools he had brought, a couple of shovels, a piece of rope, and a long, sharp iron rod. The two men were talking together, but Hiram could not understand what they said, for they spoke in the same foreign language that they had before used. But he could see his stepbrother point with his finger, now to the dead tree, and now to the steep white face of the opposite side of the bowl-like hollow. At last, having apparently rested themselves, the conference, if conference it was, came to an end, and Levi led the way, the other following, to the dead pine tree. Here he stopped and began searching, as though for some mark. Then, having found that which he looked for, he drew a tape line and a large brass pocket compass from his pocket. He gave one end of the tape line to his companion, holding the other with his thumb pressed upon a particular part of the tree. Taking his bearings by the compass, he gave now and then some orders to the other, who moved a little to the left or the right as he bade. At last he gave a word of command, and thereupon his companion drew a wooden peg from his pocket and thrust it into the sand. From this peg as a base they again measured, taking bearings by the compass, and again drove a peg. For a third time they repeated their measurements, and then, at last, seemed to have reached the point which they aimed for. Here Levi marked a cross with his heel upon the sand. His companion brought him the pointed rod which lay beside the shovels, and then stood watching as Levi thrust it deep into the sand, again and again, as though sounding for some object below. It was some while before he found that for which he was seeking, but at last the rod struck with a jar upon some hard object below. After making sure of success by one or two additional taps with the rod, Levi left it remaining where it stood, brushing the sand from his hands. "Now fetch the shovels, Pedro," said he, speaking for the first time in English. The two men were busy for a long while, shoveling away the sand. The object for which they were seeking lay buried some 6 feet deep, and the work was heavy and laborious, the shifting sand sliding back again and again into the hole. But at last the blade of one of the shovels struck upon some hard substance, and Levi stooped and brushed away the sand with the palm of his hand. Levi's companion climbed out of the hole which they had dug, and tossed the rope which he had brought with the shovels down to the other. Levi made it fast to some object below, and then himself mounted to the level of the sand above. Pulling together, the two drew up from the hole a heavy iron-bound box, nearly 3 feet long and a foot wide and deep. Levi's companion stooped and began untying the rope which had been lashed to a ring in the lid. What happened next happened suddenly, swiftly, terribly. Levi drew back a single step and shot one quick, keen look to right and to left. He passed his hand rapidly behind his back, and the next moment Hiram saw the moonlight gleam upon the long, sharp, keen blade of a knife. Levi raised his arm. Then, just as the other arose from bending over the chest, he struck, and struck again, 2 swift, powerful blows. Hiram saw the blade dive, clean and sharp, into the back, and heard the hilt strike with a dull thud against the ribs, once, twice. The burly, black-bearded wretch gave a shrill, terrible cry and fell staggering back. Then, in an instant, with another cry, he was up and clutched Levi with a clutch of despair by the throat and by the arm. Then followed a struggle, short, terrible, silent. Not a sound was heard but the deep panting breath and the scuffling of feet in the sand, upon which there now poured and dabbled a dark purple stream. But it was a one-sided struggle and lasted only for a second or two. Levi wrenched his arm loose from the wounded man's grasp, tearing his shirt-sleeve from the wrist to the shoulder as he did so. Again and again the cruel knife was lifted, and again it fell, now no longer bright, but stained with red. Then suddenly all was over. Levi's companion dropped to the sand without a sound, like a bundle of rags. For a moment he lay limp and inert. Then one shuddering spasm passed over him, and he lay silent and still, with his face half buried in the sand. Levi, with the knife still gripped tight in his hand, stood leaning over his victim, looking down upon his body. His shirt and hand, and even his naked arm, were stained and blotched with blood. The moon lit up his face, and it was the face of a devil from hell. At last he gave himself a shake, stooped and wiped his knife and hand and arm upon the loose petticoat breeches of the dead man. He thrust his knife back into its sheath, drew a key from his pocket, and unlocked the chest. In the moonlight Hiram could see that it was filled mostly with paper and leather bags, full, apparently, of money. All through this awful struggle and its awful ending, Hiram lay, dumb and motionless, upon the crest of the sandhill, looking with a horrid fascination upon the death struggle in the pit below. Now Hiram arose. The sand slid whispering down from the crest as he did so, but Levi was too intent in turning over the contents of the chest to notice the slight sound. Hiram's face was ghastly pale and drawn. For one moment he opened his lips as though to speak, but no word came. So, white, silent, he stood for a few seconds, rather like a statue than a living man. Then suddenly his eyes fell upon the bag, which Levi had brought with him, no doubt to carry back the treasure for which he and his companion were in search, and which still lay spread out on the sand where it had been flung. Then, as though a thought had suddenly flashed upon him, his whole expression changed. His lips closed tightly together as though fearing an involuntary sound might escape, and the haggard look dissolved from his face. Cautiously, slowly, he stepped over the edge of the sandhill and down the slanting face. His coming was as silent as death, for his feet made no noise as he sank ankle-deep in the yielding surface. So, stealthily, step by step, he descended, reached the bag, lifted it silently. Levi, still bending over the chest and searching through the papers within, was not 4 feet away. Hiram raised the bag in his hands. He must have made some slight rustle as he did so, for suddenly Levi half turned his head. But he was one instant too late. In a flash, the bag was over his head, shoulders, arms, body. Then came another struggle, as fierce, as silent, as desperate as that other, and as short. Wiry, tough, and strong as he was, with a lean, sinewy, nervous vigor, fighting desperately for his life as he was, Levi had no chance against the ponderous strength of his stepbrother. In any case, the struggle could not have lasted long. As it was, Levi stumbled backward over the body of his dead mate and fell, with Hiram upon him. Maybe he was stunned by the fall, maybe he felt the hopelessness of resistance, for he lay quite still while Hiram, kneeling upon him, drew the rope from the ring of the chest, and without uttering a word, bound it tightly around both the bag and the captive within, knotting it again and again and drawing it tight. Only once was a word spoken. "If you'll let me go," said a muffled voice from the bag, "I'll give you 5,000 pounds. It's in that there box." Hiram answered never a word, but continued knotting the rope and drawing it tight. Subchapter 13. The Scorpion sloop of war lay in Lewes Harbor all that winter and spring, probably upon the slim chance of a return of the pirates. It was about 8 o'clock in the morning, and Lieutenant Maynard was sitting in Squire Hall's office, fanning himself with his hat, and talking in a desultory fashion. Suddenly the dim and distant noise of a great crowd was heard from without, coming nearer and nearer. The squire and his visitor hurried to the door. The crowd was coming down the street shouting, jostling, struggling, some on the footway, some in the roadway. Heads were at the doors and windows looking down upon them. Nearer they came and nearer. Then at last they could see that the press surrounded and accompanied one man. It was Hiram White, hatless, coatless, the sweat running down his face in streams, but stolid and silent as ever. Over his shoulder he carried a bag, tied round and round with a rope. It was not until the crowd and the man it surrounded had come quite near that the squire and the lieutenant saw that a pair of legs in gray yarn stockings hung from the bag. It was a man he was carrying. Hiram had lugged his burden 5 miles that morning without help and was scarcely a rest on the way. He came directly toward the squire's office and, still surrounded and hustled by the crowd, up the steep steps to the office within. He flung his burden heavily upon the floor without a word and wiped his streaming forehead. The squire stood with his knuckles on his desk, staring first at Hiram and then at the strange burden he had brought. A sudden hush fell upon all, though the voices of those without sounded as loud and turbulent as ever. "What is it, Hiram?" said Squire Hall at last. Then for the first time Hiram spoke, panting thickly. "It's a bloody murderer," said he, pointing a quivering finger at the motionless figure. "Here, some of you," called out the squire. "Come, untie this man. Who is he?" A dozen willing fingers quickly unknotted the rope, and the bag was slipped from the head and body. Hair and face and eyebrows and clothes were powdered with meal, but, in spite of all and through all the innocent whiteness, dark spots and blotches and smears of blood showed upon head and arm and shirt. Levi raised himself upon his elbow and looked scowlingly around at the amazed, wonder-struck faces surrounding him. "Why, it's Levi West," croaked the squire, at last finding his voice. Then suddenly Lieutenant Maynard pushed forward, before the others crowded around the figure on the floor, and clutching Levi by the hair, dragged his head backward so as to better see his face. "Levi West," said he in a loud voice. "Is this the Levi West you've been telling me of? Look at that scar and mark on his cheek. This is Blueskin himself." Subchapter 14. In the chest which Blueskin had dug up out of the sand were found not only the goldsmith's bills taken from the packet, but also many other valuables belonging to the officers and the passengers of the unfortunate ship. The New York agents offered Hiram a handsome reward for his efforts in recovering the lost bills, but Hiram declined it, positively and finally. "All I want," said he, in his usual dull, stolid fashion, "is to have folks know I'm honest." Nevertheless, though he did not accept what the agents of the packet offered, fate took the matter into its own hands and rewarded him not unsubstantially. Blueskin was taken to England in the Scorpion, but he never came to trial. While in Newgate he hanged himself to the cell window with his own stockings. The news of his end was brought to Lewes in the early autumn, and Squire Hall took immediate measures to have the £500 of his father's legacy duly transferred to Hiram. In November, Hiram married the pirate's widow. End of Blueskin, the Pirate.
With the Buccaneers. Being an account of certain adventures that befell Henry Mostyn under Captain H. Morgan in the year 1665-66. Subchapter 1. Although this narration has more particularly to do with the taking of the Spanish vice admiral in the harbor of Portobello, and the rescue therefrom of Le Sieur Simon, his wife and daughter, the adventure of which was successfully achieved by Captain Morgan, the famous buccaneer, we shall, nevertheless, premise something of the earlier history of Master Harry Mostyn, whom you may, if you please, consider as the hero of the several circumstances recounted in these pages. In the year 1664, our hero's father embarked from Portsmouth, in England, for the Barbados, where he owned a considerable sugar plantation. Thither to those parts of America he transported with himself his whole family, of whom our Master Harry was the fifth of 8 children. A great lusty fellow, as little fitted for the church for which he was designed as could be. At the time of this story, though not above 16 years old, Master Harry Mostyn was as big and well grown as a man of 20, and of such a reckless and daredevil spirit that no adventure was too dangerous or too mischievous for him to embark upon. At this time there was a deal of talk in those parts of the Americas concerning Captain Morgan, and the prodigious successes he was having pirating against the Spaniards. This man had once been an indentured servant with Mr. Rolls, a sugar factor at the Barbados. Having served out his time, and being of lawless disposition, possessing also a prodigious appetite for adventure, he joined with others of his kidney, and, purchasing a caravel of 3 guns, embarked fairly upon that career of piracy, the most successful that ever was heard of in the world. Master Harry had known this man very well while he was still with Mr. Rolls, serving as a clerk at that gentleman's sugar wharf, a tall, broad-shouldered, strapping fellow, with red cheeks and thick red lips, and rolling blue eyes, and hair as red as any chestnut. Many knew him for a bold, gruff-spoken man, but no one at that time suspected that he had it in him to become so famous and renowned as he afterward grew to be. The fame of his exploits had been the talk of those parts for above a 12-month, when, in the latter part of the year 1665, Captain Morgan, having made a very successful expedition against the Spaniards into the Gulf of Campeche, where he took several important purchases from the Plate fleet, came to the Barbados, there to fit out another such venture and to enlist recruits. He and certain other adventurers had purchased a vessel of some 500 tons, which they proposed to convert into a pirate by cutting portholes for cannon and running 3 or 4 carronades across her main deck. The name of this ship, be it mentioned, was the Good Samaritan, as ill-fitting a name as could be for such a craft, which, instead of being designed for the healing of wounds, was intended to inflict such devastation as those wicked men proposed. Here was a piece of mischief exactly fitted to our hero's tastes. Wherefore, having made up a bundle of clothes, and with not above a shilling in his pocket, he made an excursion into the town to seek for Captain Morgan. There he found the great pirate established at an ordinary, with a little court of ragamuffins and swashbucklers gathered about him, all talking very loud, and drinking healths in raw rum as though it were sugared water. And what a fine figure our buccaneer had grown, to be sure! How different from the poor, humble clerk upon the sugar wharf! What a deal of gold braid! What a fine silver-hilted Spanish sword! What a gay velvet sling, hung with 3 silver-mounted pistols! If Master Harry's mind had not been made up before, to be sure such a spectacle of glory would have determined it. This figure of war our hero asked to step aside with him, and when they had come into a corner, proposed to the other what he intended, and that he had a mind to enlist as a gentleman adventurer upon this expedition. Upon this our rogue of a buccaneer captain burst out a-laughing,
and fetching Master Harry a great thump upon the back, swore roundly that he would make a man of him, and that it was a pity to make a parson out of so good a piece of stuff. Nor was Captain Morgan less good than his word, for when the Good Samaritan set sail with a favoring wind for the island of Jamaica, Master Harry found himself established as one of the adventurers aboard. End of Subchapter 1. Subchapter 2. Could you but have seen the town of Port Royal as it appeared in the year 1665, you would have beheld a sight very well worth while looking upon. There were no fine houses at that time, and no great counting houses built of brick, such as you may find nowadays, but a crowd of board and wattled huts huddled along the streets, and all so gay with flags and bits of color that Vanity Fair itself could not have been gayer. To this place came all the pirates and buccaneers that infested those parts, and men shouted and swore and gambled, and poured out money like water, and then maybe wound up their merrymaking by dying of fever. For the sky in these torrid latitudes is all full of clouds overhead, and as hot as any blanket, and when the sun shone forth, it streamed down upon the smoking sands, so that the houses were ovens, and the streets were furnaces. So it was little wonder that men died like rats in a hole. But little they appeared to care for that, so that everywhere you might behold a multitude of painted women, and Jews and merchants and pirates, gaudy with red scarves and gold braid, and all sorts of odds and ends of foolish finery, all fighting and gambling and bartering for that ill-gotten treasure of the berobbed Spaniard. Here arriving, Captain Morgan found a hearty welcome, and a message from the governor awaiting him, the message bidding him attend his excellency upon the earliest occasion that offered. Whereupon, taking our hero, of whom he had grown prodigiously fond, along with him, our pirate went, without any loss of time, to visit Sir Thomas Modiford, who was then the royal governor of all this devil's brew of wickedness. They found his excellency seated in a great easy-chair, under the shadow of a slatted veranda, the floor whereof was paved with brick. He was clad, for the sake of coolness, only in his shirt, breeches, and stockings, and he wore slippers on his feet. He was smoking a great cigarro of tobacco, and a goblet of lime juice and water and rum stood at his elbow on a table. Here, out of the glare of the heat, it was all very cool and pleasant, with a sea breeze blowing violently in through the slats, setting them a-rattling now and then, and stirring Sir Thomas's long hair, which he had pushed back for the sake of coolness. The purport of this interview, I may tell you, concerned the rescue of one Le Sieur Simon, who, together with his wife and daughter, was held captive by the Spaniards. This gentleman adventurer, Le Sieur Simon, had, a few years before, been set up by the Buccaneers as governor of the island of Santa Catharina. This place, though well fortified by the Spaniards, the Buccaneers had seized upon, establishing themselves thereon, and so infesting the commerce of those seas that no Spanish fleet was safe from them. At last the Spaniards, no longer able to endure these assaults against their commerce, sent a great force against the freebooters to drive them out of their island stronghold. This they did, retaking Santa Catharina, together with its governor, his wife and daughter, as well as the whole garrison of Buccaneers. This garrison was sent by their conquerors, some to the galleys, some to the mines, some to no man knows where. The governor himself, Le Sieur Simon, was to be sent to Spain, there to stand his trial for piracy. The news of all this, I may tell you, had only just been received in Jamaica, having been brought thither by a Spanish captain, one Don Rodriguez Sylvia, who was, besides, the bearer of dispatches to the Spanish authorities relating the whole affair. Such, in fine, was the purport of this interview, and as our hero and his captain walked back together from the governor's house to the ordinary, where they had taken up their inn, the buccaneer assured his companion that he proposed to obtain those dispatches from the Spanish captain that very afternoon, even if he had to use force to seize them. All this, you are to understand, was undertaken only because of the friendship that the governor and Captain Morgan entertained for Le Sieur Simon. And indeed, it was wonderful how honest and how faithful were these wicked men in their dealings with one another. For you must know that Governor Modiford and Le Sieur Simon and the Buccaneers were all of one kidney, all taking a share in the piracies of those times, and all holding by one another,
as though they were the honestest men in the world. Hence it was they were all so determined to rescue Le Sieur Simon from the Spaniards. End of subchapter 2. Subchapter 3. Having reached his ordinary after his interview with the governor, Captain Morgan found there a number of his companions, such as usually gathered at that place to be in attendance upon him. Some, those belonging to the Good Samaritan; others, those who hoped to obtain benefits from him; others, those ragamuffins who gathered around him because he was famous, and because it pleased them to be of his court and to be called his followers. For nearly always your successful pirate had such a little court surrounding him. Finding a dozen or more of these rascals gathered there, Captain Morgan informed them of his present purpose, that he was going to find the Spanish captain to demand his papers of him, and calling upon them to accompany him. With this following at his heels, our buccaneer started off down the street, his lieutenant, a Cornish man named Bartholomew Davis, upon one hand, and our hero upon the other. So they paraded the streets for the best part of an hour before they found the Spanish captain. For whether he got wind that Captain Morgan was searching for him, or whether, finding himself in a place so full of his enemies, he had buried himself in some place of hiding, it is certain that the buccaneers had traversed pretty nearly the whole town before they discovered that he was lying at a certain auberge kept by a Portuguese Jew. Thither they went, and thither Captain Morgan entered with the utmost coolness and composure of demeanor, his followers crowding noisily in at his heels. The space within was very dark, being lighted only by the doorway and by two large slatted windows or openings in the front. In this dark hot place, not over roomy at the best, were gathered 12 or 15 villainous appearing men, sitting at tables and drinking together, waited upon by the Jew and his wife. Our hero had no trouble in discovering which of this lot of men was Captain Sylvia, for not only did Captain Morgan direct his glance full of war upon him, but the Spaniard was clad with more particularity and with more show of finery than any of the others who were there. Him Captain Morgan approached and demanded his papers, whereunto the other replied with such a jabber of Spanish and English that no man could have understood what he said. To this Captain Morgan in turn replied that he must have those papers, no matter what it might cost him to obtain them, and thereupon drew a pistol from his sling and presented it at the other's head. At this threatening action the innkeeper's wife fell a-screaming, and the Jew, as in a frenzy, besought them not to tear the house down about his ears. Our hero could hardly tell what followed, only that all of a sudden there was a prodigious uproar of combat. Knives flashed everywhere, and then a pistol was fired so close to his head that he stood like one stunned, hearing someone crying out in a loud voice, but not knowing whether it was a friend or a foe who had been shot. Then another pistol shot so deafened what was left of Harry Masters' hearing that his ears rang for above an hour afterward. By this time the whole place was full of gunpowder smoke, and there was the sound of blows and oaths and outcrying and the clashing of knives. As Master Harry, who had no great stomach for such a combat, and no very particular interest in the quarrel, was making for the door, a little Portuguese, as withered and as nimble as an ape, came ducking under the table, and plunged at his stomach with a great long knife, which, had it effected its object, would surely have ended his adventures then and there. Finding himself in such danger, Master Harry snatched up a heavy chair, and flinging it at his enemy, who was preparing for another attack, he fairly ran for it out of the door, expecting every instant to feel the thrust of the blade betwixt his ribs. A considerable crowd had gathered outside, and others, hearing the uproar, were coming running to join them. With these our hero stood, trembling like a leaf, and with cold chills running up and down his back like water at the narrow escape from the danger that had threatened him. Nor shall you think him a coward, for you must remember he was hardly 16 years old at the time, and that this was the first affair of the sort he had encountered. Afterward, as you shall learn, he showed that he could exhibit courage enough at a pinch. While he stood there endeavoring to recover his composure, the while the tumult continued within, suddenly 2 men came running almost together out of the door, a crowd of the combatants at their heels. The first of these men was Captain Sylvia. The other, who was pursuing him, was Captain Morgan. As the crowd about the door parted before the sudden appearing of these,
The Spanish captain, perceiving, as he supposed, a way of escape open to him, darted across the street with incredible swiftness toward an alleyway upon the other side. Upon this, seeing his prey like to get away from him, Captain Morgan snatched a pistol out of his sling, and resting it for an instant across his arm, fired at the flying Spaniard, and that with so true an aim that though the street was now full of people, the other went tumbling over and over all of a heap in the kennel, where he lay, after a twitch or two, as still as a log. At the sound of the shot and the fall of the man, the crowd scattered upon all sides, yelling and screaming, and the street being thus pretty clear, Captain Morgan ran across the way to where his victim lay, his smoking pistol still in his hand, and our hero following close at his heels. Our poor Harry had never before beheld a man killed thus in an instant, who a moment before had been so full of life and activity. For when Captain Morgan turned the body over upon its back, he could perceive at a glance, little as he knew of such matters, that the man was stone dead. And indeed, it was a dreadful sight for him who was hardly more than a child. He stood rooted for he knew not how long, staring down at the dead face with twitching fingers and shuddering limbs. Meantime, a great crowd was gathering about them again. As for Captain Morgan, he went about his work with the utmost coolness and deliberation imaginable, unbuttoning the waistcoat and the shirt of the man he had murdered with fingers that neither twitched nor shook. There was a gold cross and a bunch of silver medals hung by a whipcord about the neck of the dead man. This Captain Morgan broke away with a snap, reaching the jingling baubles to Harry, who took them in his nerveless hand and fingers that he could hardly close upon what they held. The papers Captain Morgan found in a wallet in an inner breast pocket of the Spaniard's waistcoat. These he examined one by one, and finding them to his satisfaction, tied them up again and slipped the wallet and its contents into his own pocket. Then for the first time he appeared to observe Master Harry, who indeed must have been standing, the perfect picture of horror and dismay. Whereupon, bursting out a-laughing, and slipping the pistol he had used back into its sling again, he fetched poor Harry a great slap upon the back, bidding him to be a man, for that he would see many such sights as this. But indeed it was no laughing matter for poor Master Harry, for it was many a day before his imagination could rid itself of the image of the dead Spaniard's face, and as he walked away down the street with his companions, leaving the crowd behind them, and the dead body where it lay for its friends to look after, his ears humming and ringing with the deafening noise of the pistol shots fired in the close room, and the sweat trickling down his face in drops, he knew not whether all that had passed had been real, or whether it was a dream from which he might presently awaken. End of Subchapter 3. Subchapter 4. The papers Captain Morgan had thus seized upon as the fruit of the murder he had committed must have been as perfectly satisfactory to him as could be, for having paid a second visit that evening to Governor Modiford, the pirate lifted anchor the next morning and made sail toward the Gulf of Darien. There, after cruising about in those waters for about a fortnight without falling in with a vessel of any sort, at the end of that time they overhauled a caravel bound from Portobello to Cartagena, which vessel they took, and finding her loaded with nothing better than raw hides, scuttled and sank her, being then about 20 leagues from the main of Cartagena. From the captain of this vessel they learned that the Plate fleet was then lying in the harbor of Portobello, not yet having set sail thence, but waiting for the change of the winds before embarking for Spain. Besides this, which was a good deal more to their purpose, the Spaniards told the pirates that the Sieur Simon, his wife, and daughter were confined aboard the vice admiral of that fleet, and that the name of the vice admiral was the Santa Maria of Valladolid. As soon as Captain Morgan had obtained the information he desired, he directed his course straight for the bay of Santa Blazo, where he might lie safely within the cape of that name without any danger of discovery, that part of the mainland being entirely uninhabited, and yet be within 20 or 25 leagues of Portobello. Having come safely to this anchorage, he at once declared his intentions to his companions, which were as follows: that it was entirely impossible for them to hope to sail their vessel into the harbor of Portobello, and to attack the Spanish vice admiral where he lay in the midst of the armed flota. Wherefore, if anything was to be accomplished,
It must be undertaken by some subtle design rather than by open-handed boldness. Having so prefaced what he had to say, he now declared that it was his purpose to take one of the ship's boats and to go in that to Portobello, trusting for some opportunity to occur to aid him either in the accomplishment of his aims or in the gaining of some further information. Having thus delivered himself, he invited any who dared to do so to volunteer for the expedition, telling them plainly that he would constrain no man to go against his will, for that at best it was a desperate enterprise, possessing only the recommendation that in its achievement the few who undertook it would gain great renown, and perhaps a very considerable booty. And such was the incredible influence of this bold man over his companions, and such was their confidence in his skill and cunning, that not above a dozen of all those aboard hung back from the undertaking, but nearly every man desired to be taken. Of these volunteers Captain Morgan chose 20, among others our Master Harry, and having arranged with his lieutenant that if nothing was heard from the expedition at the end of 3 days he should sail for Jamaica to await news, he embarked upon that enterprise, which, though never heretofore published, was perhaps the boldest and the most desperate of all those that have since made his name so famous. For what could be a more unparalleled undertaking than for a little open boat, containing but 20 men, to enter the harbor of the third strongest fortress of the Spanish mainland with the intention of cutting out the Spanish vice admiral from the midst of a whole fleet of powerfully armed vessels? And how many men in all the world do you suppose would venture such a thing? But there is this to be said of that great buccaneer, that if he undertook enterprises so desperate as this, he yet laid his plans so well that they never went altogether amiss. Moreover, the very desperation of his successes was of such a nature that no man could suspect that he would dare to undertake such things, and accordingly his enemies were never prepared to guard against his attacks. Aye, had he but worn the king's colours and served under the rules of honest war, he might have become as great and as renowned as Admiral Blake himself. But all that is neither here nor there. What I have to tell you now is that Captain Morgan in this open boat with his 20 mates reached the Cape of Salmedina toward the fall of day. Arriving within view of the harbor, they discovered the plate fleet at anchor, with 2 men of war and an armed galley riding as a guard at the mouth of the harbor, scarce half a league distant from the other ships. Having spied the fleet in this posture, the pirates presently pulled down their sails and rowed along the coast, feigning to be a Spanish vessel from Nombre de Dios. So hugging the shore, they came boldly within the harbor, upon the opposite side of which you might see the fortress a considerable distance away. Being now come so near to the consummation of their adventure, Captain Morgan required every man to make an oath to stand by him to the last, whereunto our hero swore as heartily as any man aboard, although his heart, I must needs confess, was beating at a great rate at the approach of what was to happen. Having thus received the oaths of all his followers, Captain Morgan commanded the surgeon of the expedition that, when the order was given, he, the medico, was to bore 6 holes in the boat, so that, it sinking under them, they might all be compelled to push forward with no chance of retreat. And such was the ascendancy of this man over his followers, and such was their awe of him, that not one of them uttered even so much as a murmur, though what he had commanded the surgeon to do pledged them either to victory or to death, with no chance to choose between. Nor did the surgeon question the orders he had received, much less did he dream of disobeying them. By now it had fallen pretty dusk, whereupon, spying 2 fishermen in a canoe at a little distance, Captain Morgan demanded of them in Spanish which vessel of those at anchor in the harbor was the vice admiral, for that he had dispatches for the captain thereof. Whereupon the fishermen, suspecting nothing, pointed them to a galleon of great size, riding at anchor not half a league distant. Toward this vessel accordingly the pirates directed their course, and when they had come pretty nigh, Captain Morgan called upon the surgeon that now it was time for him to perform the duty that had been laid upon him. Whereupon the other did as he was ordered, and that so thoroughly that the water presently came gushing into the boat in great streams, whereat all hands pulled for the galleon as though every next moment was to be their last. And what do you suppose were our hero's emotions at this time? Like all in the boat, His awe of Captain Morgan was so great that I do believe he would rather have gone to the bottom than have questioned his command, even when it was to scuttle the boat. Nevertheless, when he felt the cold water gushing about his feet, for he had taken off his shoes and stockings, he became possessed with such a fear of being drowned that even the Spanish galleon had no terrors for him if he could only feel the solid planks thereof beneath his feet. Indeed, all the crew appeared to be possessed of a like dismay, for they pulled at the oars with such an incredible force that they were under the quarter of the galleon before the boat was half filled with water. Here, as they approached, it then being pretty dark and the moon not yet having risen, the watch upon the deck hailed them, whereupon Captain Morgan called out in Spanish that he was Captain Alvarez Mendazo, and that he brought dispatches for the vice-admiral. But at that moment, the boat being now so full of water as to be logged, it suddenly tilted upon one side as though to sink beneath them, whereupon all hands, without further orders, went scrambling up the side, as nimble as so many monkeys, each armed with a pistol in one hand and a cutlass in the other, and so were upon the deck before the watch could collect his wits to utter any outcry or to give any other alarm than to cry out, "Jesu bless us, who are these?" At which words somebody knocked him down with the butt of a pistol, though who it was our hero could not tell in the darkness and the hurry. Before any of those upon deck could recover from their alarm, or those from below come up upon the deck, a part of the pirates, under the carpenter and the surgeon, had run to the gunroom and had taken possession of the arms, while Captain Morgan, with Master Harry and a Portuguese called Murillo Braziliano, had flown with the speed of the wind into the great cabin. Here they found the captain of the vice-admiral playing at cards with the Sieur Simon and a friend, Madame Simon and her daughter being present. Captain Morgan instantly set his pistol at the breast of the Spanish captain, swearing with a most horrible fierce countenance that if he spake a word or made any outcry he was a dead man. As for our hero, having now got his hand into the game, he performed the same service for the Spaniard's friend, declaring he would shoot him dead if he opened his lips or lifted so much as a single finger. All this while the ladies, not comprehending what had occurred, had sat as mute as stones, but now having so far recovered themselves as to find a voice, the younger of the two fell to screaming, at which the Sieur Simon called out to her to be still, for these were friends who had come to help them, and not enemies who had come to harm them. All this, you are to understand, occupied only a little while, for in less than a minute 3 or 4 of the pirates had come into the cabin, who, together with the Portuguese, proceeded at once to bind the 2 Spaniards hand and foot and to gag them. This being done to our buccaneer's satisfaction, and the Spanish captain being stretched out in the corner of the cabin, he instantly cleared his countenance of its terrors, and bursting forth into a great loud laugh, clapped his hand to the Sieur Simon's, which he wrung with the best will in the world. Having done this, and being in a fine humour after this his first success, he turned to the 2 ladies. "And this, ladies," said he, taking our hero by the hand and presenting him, "is a young gentleman who has embarked with me to learn the trade of piracy. I recommend him to your politeness." Think what a confusion this threw our Master Harry into, to be sure, who at his best was never easy in the company of strange ladies. You may suppose what must have been his emotions to find himself thus introduced to the attention of Madame Simon and her daughter, being at the time in his bare feet, clad only in his shirt and breeches, and with no hat upon his head, a pistol in one hand and a cutlass in the other. However, he was not left for long to his embarrassments, for almost immediately after he had thus far relaxed, Captain Morgan fell of a sudden serious again, and bidding the Sieur Simon to get his ladies away into some place of safety, for the most hazardous part of this adventure was yet to occur, he quitted the cabin with Master Harry and the other pirates, for you may call him a pirate now, at his heels. Having come upon deck, our hero beheld that a part of the Spanish crew were huddled forward in a flock like so many sheep, the others being crowded below with the hatches fastened upon them, and such was the terror of the pirates, and so dreadful the name of Henry Morgan, that not one of those poor wretches dared to lift up his voice to give any alarm, not even to attempt an escape by jumping overboard. At Captain Morgan's orders, these men, together with certain of his own company, ran nimbly aloft and began setting the sails, which, the night now having fallen pretty thick, was not for a good while observed by any of the vessels riding at anchor about them. Indeed, the pirates might have made good their escape, which at most only a shot or two from the men of war, had it not then been about the full of the moon, which, having arisen, presently discovered to those of the fleet that lay closest about them what was being done aboard the vice-admiral. At this, one of the vessels hailed them, and then after a while, having no reply, hailed them again. Even then, the Spaniards might not immediately have suspected anything was amiss, but only that the vice-admiral, for some reason best known to himself, was shifting his anchorage, had not one of the Spaniards aloft, but who it was Captain Morgan was never able to discover, answered the hail by crying out that the vice-admiral had been seized by the pirates. At this the alarm was instantly given and the mischief done, for presently there was a tremendous bustle through that part of the fleet lying nighest the vice-admiral, a deal of shouting of orders, a beating of drums, and the running hither and thither of the crews. But by this time the sails of the vice-admiral had filled with a strong land breeze that was blowing up the harbor, whereupon the carpenter, at Captain Morgan's orders, having cut away both anchors, the galleon presently bore away up the harbor, gathering headway every moment with the wind nearly dead astern. The nearest vessel was the only one that for the moment was able to offer any hindrance. This ship, having by this time cleared away one of its guns, was able to fire a parting shot against the vice-admiral, striking her somewhere forward, as our hero could see by a great shower of splinters that flew up in the moonlight. At the sound of the shot all the vessels of the flota, not yet disturbed by the alarm, were aroused at once, so that the pirates had the satisfaction of knowing that they would have to run the gauntlet of all the ships between them and the open sea before they could reckon themselves escaped. And indeed, to our hero's mind it seemed that the battle which followed must have been the most terrific cannonade that was ever heard in the world. It was not so ill at first, for it was some while before the Spaniards could get their guns clear for action, they being not the least in the world prepared for such an occasion as this. But by and by, first one and then another ship opened fire upon the galleon, until it seemed to our hero that all the thunders of heaven let loose upon them could not have created a more prodigious uproar, and that it was not possible that they could any of them escape destruction. By now the moon had risen full and round, so that the clouds of smoke that rose in the air appeared as white as snow. The air seemed full of the hiss and screaming of shot, each one of which, when it struck the galleon, was magnified by our hero's imagination into 10 times its magnitude from the crash which it delivered and from the cloud of splinters it would cast up into the moonlight. At last he suddenly beheld one poor man knocked sprawling across the deck, who, as he raised his arm from behind the mast, disclosed that the hand was gone from it, and that the shirt sleeve was red with blood in the moonlight. At this sight all the strength fell away from poor Harry, and he felt sure that a like fate or even a worse must be in store for him. But, after all, this was nothing to what it might have been in broad daylight, for what with the darkness of night, and the little preparation the Spaniards could make for such a business, and the extreme haste with which they discharged their guns, many not understanding what was the occasion of all this uproar, nearly all the shot flew so wide of the mark that not above 1 in 20 struck that at which it was aimed. Meantime Captain Morgan, with the Sieur Simon, who had followed him upon deck, stood just above where our hero lay behind the shelter of the bulwark. The captain had lit a pipe of tobacco, and he stood now in the brilliant moonlight close to the rail, with his hands behind him, looking out ahead with the utmost coolness imaginable, and paying no more attention to the din of battle than though it were 20 leagues away. Now and then he would take his pipe from his lips to utter an order to the man at the wheel. Excepting this, he stood there hardly moving at all, the wind blowing his long red hair over his shoulders. Had it not been for the armed galley, the pirates might have gotten the galleon away with no great harm done, in spite of all this cannonading, for the man of war which rode at anchor nighest to them at the mouth of the harbor was still so far away that they might have passed it by hugging pretty close to the shore, and that without any great harm being done to them in the darkness. But just at this moment, when the open water lay in sight, came this galley pulling out from behind the point of the shore in such a manner as either to head our pirates off entirely, or else to compel them to approach so near to the man of war that the latter vessel could bring its guns to bear with more effect. This galley, I must tell you, was like others of its kind, such as you may find in these waters, the hull being long and cut low to the water as to allow the oars to dip freely. The bow was sharp and projected far out ahead, mounting a swivel upon it, while at the stern a number of galleries built one above another into a castle gave shelter to several companies of musketeers as well as the officers commanding them. Our hero could behold the approach of this galley from above the starboard bulwarks, and it appeared to him impossible for them to hope to escape either it or the man of war. But still Captain Morgan maintained the same composure that he had exhibited all the while, only now and then delivering an order to the man at the wheel, who, putting the helm over, threw the bows of the galleon around more to the larboard, as though to escape the bow of the galley and get into the open water beyond. This course brought the pirates ever closer and closer to the man of war, which now began to add its thunder to the din of the battle, and with so much more effect that at every discharge you might hear the crashing and crackling of splintered wood, and now and then the outcry or groaning of some man who was hurt. Indeed, had it been daylight, they must at this juncture all have perished, though, as was said, what with the night and the confusion and the hurry, they escaped entire destruction, though more by a miracle than through any policy upon their own part. Meanwhile the galley, steering as though to come aboard of them, had now come so near that it too presently began to open its musketry fire upon them, so that the humming and rattling of bullets were presently added to the din of cannonading. In 2 minutes more it would have been aboard of them, when in a moment Captain Morgan roared out of a sudden to the man at the helm to put it hard a starboard. In response the man ran the wheel over with the utmost quickness, and the galleon, obeying her helm very readily, came around upon a course which, if continued, would certainly bring them into collision with their enemy. It is possible at first the Spaniards imagined the pirates intended to escape past their stern, for they instantly began backing oars to keep them from getting past, so that the water was all of a foam about them. At the same time they did this they poured in such a fire of musketry that it was a miracle that no more execution was accomplished than happened. As for our hero, methinks for the moment he forgot all about everything else than as to whether or no his captain's maneuver would succeed, for in the very first moment he divined, as by some instinct, what Captain Morgan proposed doing. At this moment, so particular in the execution of this nice design, a bullet suddenly struck down the man at the wheel. Hearing the sharp outcry, our Harry turned to see him fall forward, and then to his hands and knees upon the deck, the blood running in a black pool beneath him, while the wheel, escaping from his hands, spun over until the spokes were all of a mist. In a moment the ship would have fallen off before the wind, had not our hero, leaping to the wheel, even as Captain Morgan shouted an order for someone to do so, seized the flying spokes, whirling them back again, and so bringing the bow of the galleon upon its former course. In the first moment of this effort he had reckoned of nothing but of carrying out his captain's designs. He neither thought of cannon balls nor of bullets. But now that his task was accomplished, he came suddenly back to himself to find the galleries of the galley aflame with musket shots, and to become aware, with a most horrible sinking of the spirits, that all the shots therefrom were intended for him. He cast his eyes about him with despair, but no one came to ease him of his task, which, having undertaken, he had too much spirit to resign from carrying through to the end, though he was well aware that the very next instant might mean his sudden and violent death. His ears hummed and rang, and his brain swam as light as a feather. I know not whether he breathed, but he shut his eyes tight as though that might save him from the bullets that were raining about him. At this moment the Spaniards must have discovered for the first time the pirates' design, for of a sudden they ceased firing and began to shout out a multitude of orders, while the oars lashed the water all about with a foam. But it was too late then for them to escape, for within a couple of seconds the galleon struck her enemy a blow so violent upon the larboard quarter as nearly to hurl our Harry upon the deck, and then with a dreadful, horrible crackling of wood, commingled with a yelling of men's voices, the galley was swung around upon her side, and the galleon, sailing into the open sea, left nothing of her immediate enemy but a sinking wreck, and the water dotted all over with bobbing heads and waving hands in the moonlight. And now, indeed, that all danger was past and gone, there were plenty to come running to help our hero at the wheel. As for Captain Morgan, having come down upon the main deck,
He fetches the young helmsman a clap upon the back. "Well, Master Harry," says he, "and did I not tell you I would make a man of you?" Whereat our poor Harry fell a-laughing, but with a sad catch in his voice, for his hands trembled with an ague, and were as cold as ice. As for his emotions, God knows he was nearer crying than laughing, if Captain Morgan had but known it. Nevertheless, though undertaken under the spur of the moment, I protest it was indeed a brave deed, and I cannot but wonder how many young gentlemen of 16 there are today who, upon a like occasion, would act as well as our Harry. End of subchapter 4. Subchapter 5. The balance of our hero's adventures were of a lighter sort than those already recounted, for the next morning the Spanish captain, a very polite and well-bred gentleman, having fitted him out with a shift of his own clothes, Master Harry was presented in a proper form to the ladies. For Captain Morgan, if he had felt a liking for the young man before, could not now show sufficient regard for him. He ate in the great cabin and was petted by all. Madame Simone, who was a fat and red-faced lady, was forever praising him, and the young miss, who was extremely well-looking, was as continually making eyes at him. She and Master Harry, I must tell you, would spend hours together, she making pretence of teaching him French, although he was so possessed with a passion of love that he was nigh suffocated with it. She, upon her part, perceiving his emotions, responded with extreme good nature and complacency, so that had our hero been older and the voyage proved longer, he might have become entirely enmeshed in the toils of his fair siren. For all this while, you are to understand, the pirates were making sail straight for Jamaica, which they reached upon the third day in perfect safety. In that time, however, the pirates had well nigh gone crazy for joy, for when they came to examine their purchase, they discovered her cargo to consist of plate to the prodigious sum of 130,000 pounds in value. 'Twas a wonder they did not all make themselves drunk for joy. No doubt they would have done so, had not Captain Morgan, knowing they were still in the exact track of the Spanish fleets, threatened them that the first man among them who touched a drop of rum without his permission, he would shoot him dead upon the deck. This threat had such effect that they all remained entirely sober until they had reached Port Royal Harbor, which they did about 9 o'clock in the morning. And now it was that our hero's romance came all tumbling down about his ears with a run, for they had hardly come to anchor in the harbor when a boat came from a man of war, and who should come stepping aboard but Lieutenant Grantley, a particular friend of our hero's father, and his own eldest brother Thomas, who, putting on a very stern face, informed Master Harry that he was a desperate and hardened villain who was sure to end at the gallows, and that he was to go immediately back to his home again. He told our embryo pirate that his family had nigh gone distracted because of his wicked and ungrateful conduct, nor could our hero move him from his inflexible purpose. "What," says our Harry, "and will you not then let me wait until our prize is divided and I get my share?" "Prize indeed," says his brother, "and do you then really think that your father would consent to your having a share in this terrible bloody and murthering business?" And so, after a great deal of argument, our hero was constrained to go, nor did he even have an opportunity to bid adieu to his inamorata, nor did he see her any more, except from a distance, she standing on the poop deck as he was rowed away from her, her face all stained with crying. For himself, he felt that there was no more joy in life. Nevertheless, standing up in the stern of the boat, he made shift, though with an aching heart, to deliver her a fine bow with the hat he had borrowed from the Spanish captain, before his brother bade him sit down again. And so to the ending of this story, with only this to relate, that our Master Harry, so far from going to the gallows, became in good time a respectable and wealthy sugar merchant, with an English wife and a fine family of children, whereunto, when the mood was upon him, he has sometimes told these adventures, and sundry others not here recounted, as I have told them unto you. End of subchapter 5. End with the Buccaneers.